Long before the Parthenon of ancient Athens, before the first Temple of Israel at Jerusalem, before even the earliest pyramids for Egypt's god kings, a mysterious island civilization built some of history's earliest wonders. Malta is one of the world's smallest countries, so then how did it end up with so many of the world's oldest monuments? Made up of 2 main islands and 3 smaller ones, the tiny country of Malta could fit inside the city of Philadelphia. But despite its size, it holds a wealth of history. About 7,000 years ago, settlers from Sicily arrived on Malta. A unique civilization grew up, and by 3600 BC, people on Malta began erecting monumental temples, some of the oldest stone buildings in the world. For 1,500 years, this culture thrived in isolation, apparently free from external threats. Then, around 2000 BC, it faded away. Eventually, Malta became subsumed by the cultures of its Mediterranean neighbors. The temple people, as they're known today, only began to come to light in the 19th century, and archaeologists are still piecing together their story. By about 4000 BC, people on the islands began burying their dead in a cave complex known as the Shaura Circle on the northern island of Gozo. The site must have been especially significant because the practice continued for centuries, but the limestone was prone to caving in, so eventually the caretakers added support columns. Over time, the site gained more and more architectural features, with a massive stone entrance, new compartments added for later burials, and altars for sacrifices. The remains of an estimated 800 individuals have been discovered at Shaura. Priests or other participants disarticulated the body parts, sorting skulls and other bones into separate compartments. But Shaura was far from alone among the sacred sites of ancient Malta. All told, there are about 20 major temple complexes from a civilization that only occupied 122 square miles. Located next to Shaura are the Gigantia temples. Appropriately enough, the Maltese word Gigantia refers to giants who, according to folklore, built the colossal structures. You can understand the reasoning. The biggest stone in this complex is estimated to weigh 50 tons. In reality, a significant workforce would have had to haul the blocks into place, and the clue to how they did it lies at another temple site called Tarshin, on the largest island also called Malta. Tarshin, which includes 4 temple buildings, dates to about 3100 BC and includes the richest decoration of the sites. Relief carvings of animals and spiral patterns adorn the spaces. The buildings follow the same general shape as Gigantia and the other temples of this early period. Before each building is an oval courtyard, perhaps where the public would gather during ritual events. The imposing door frames are called trilithons, 2 tall standing stones holding a horizontal lintel. Doors would have an animal hide cover, and on the inside, a central chamber leads to several circular rooms called apses, usually 3 in a cloverleaf pattern. Each apse would have been topped by corbels, layers of decreasing size to create partial domes. Animal remains indicate that sacrificial slaughter took place in the temples. Many of the apses contain an altar. Holes in the floor would catch the blood. Clay and carved figures lay in the temples. The most characteristic statues of the early phases are rounded female figures with exaggerated features, usually interpreted as fertility symbols, but other shapes occur as well. At Shaura, a cache of several stone idols included some that were simple geometric forms and others with details like clothing and hair. Outside Tarshin lie several stone rollers, essentially long wheels, as if waiting for curious archaeologists trying to find out the ancient Maltese construction methods. But the history of transportation on Malta also held an odd puzzle. Parallel grooves in the limestone crisscross the island, almost resembling a primitive railroad. One recent experiment seems to show that they were formed by the repeated journeys of wagons. Thin soil, moisture, and pressure wore away the rock, eventually making a path unusable and forcing people to take another route. The whole island was under pressure. Soon after people arrived, most of the trees were cleared for farmland. The thin soil began eroding, which would remain a challenge for Malta up to the present day. At one especially remarkable site, chipping away at Malta's limestone bedrock enabled an architectural marvel: the underground tomb complex or hypogeum of Hasafini. The remains of more than 6,000 people were interred here, arranged into piles totaling 200,000 bones. The entire structure was carved in place out of limestone, with elements like columns imitating the structural elements in the above-ground temples. The uppermost layer began with the sculpting of existing caves. Over time, the temple people carved additional chambers in 2 descending layers. The second level contained spaces for rituals, including a room known as the Holy of Holies, which shows the same kind of corbelled dome ceiling as the temples. Researchers have detected that the space emits a low, resonant sound, barely audible. According to their theory, the acoustics of sacred places such as this added to the spiritual experience, as the ritual goers' bodies picked up the vibrations. The shaking itself may be the result of tectonic activity. Malta lies right on the boundary between the European and African plates of the Earth's crust. In any case, the hypogeum creates echoes of extraordinary length. But why so many elaborate temples in such a small area? According to the archaeologists who excavated the Shara Circle, there may have been a social competition going on, with each community showing a kind of civic pride in their lavish construction. Enormous energy went into the digging of a necropolis or the sliding of multi-ton slabs. All the while, the agricultural productivity may not have been keeping up. Another enigma, the temple people seem to have gotten most of their food from the land and to have consumed very little seafood. Toward the end of the era of the temple people, a prized imported red pigment from Sicily seems to have become less available, perhaps indicating an economic slump. The social collapse in the archaeological record shows up at 2500 BC, when all monumental construction stops. A transition begins to a completely different culture, marked by the cremation of the dead. Ecological decline may have played a role. There's no evidence of an invasion or an epidemic. What remains shows the complete cycle of a civilization that flourished and then returned like its own dead to the earth.
You may have heard of the Mayan civilization in your history class, observed their ruins when you visited Mexico, or seen their portrayals in the Mel Gibson movie Apocalypto. You may also know them as the people who predicted our world's demise, a date that's constantly been shifted by conspiracy theorists every time the collapse of the Earth fails to materialize. But given our current multiple existential crises, it is likely one day those predicting the end of the world will be right. Broken clocks and all that. Anyway, over 1,000 years ago, the mighty Mayan civilization, one of the most impressive empires of the Western Hemisphere, just disappeared. How did the Mayans predict the end of the world but fail to divine their own collapse? And how did their civilization fall apart anyway? We sent a very reluctant and panicked research team back in time to the moment just before the Mayan Empire fell to find out what happened. The first signs of the Mayan civilization appeared in 1500 BC. In modern-day Guatemala, southern Mexico, and parts of Belize, small villages started to form, organized around the cultivation of maize or corn, beans, and squash. Gradually, the Mayans developed more advanced farming techniques, like irrigation and terracing systems. However, they weren't the only civilizations in the area at the time. In fact, the Mayans lived side by side with the Olmecs, widely regarded as the first mother culture of the region of present-day Mexico. Most archaeologists and historians believe the Olmecs significantly influenced Mayan society. However, more recent findings have raised questions about whether the Olmecs actually came first or if the two civilizations developed simultaneously. Doctors Takeshi Inomata and Daniela Triadin, a husband and wife anthropologist team that we can only assume led an Indiana Jones-like existence, spent years excavating the ruins of the ancient Mayan city of Ceibal. Originally, Ceibal was thought to have been almost wholly influenced and inspired by the Olmec city of La Venta. However, when doctors Inomata and Triadin used radiocarbon dating on the oldest structures they discovered at Ceibal, they discovered that they predated most ancient construction found in La Venta by 200 years. Thus, it seems that the Olmecs were not the Mayans' mother civilization, but rather developed around the same time. Many archaeologists now believe that the definite distinctions between Olmecs and Mayans are erroneous to begin with, and it's likely that many such Mesoamerican mini-civilizations started developing concurrently after the start of maize agriculture, borrowing from and influencing each other, eventually likely blending into one big society. This belief is strengthened by the fact that mentions of the Olmecs gradually vanish from writings over time, and the Olmecs as a group seem to disappear almost completely by 400 BC. However, the Mayan civilization continued to advance and grow at an impressive pace. Over the next centuries, the original Mayan villages kept growing and expanding until they became full-fledged cities. Unlike the first communities of basic houses and farms, these cities had large religious centers, temples, palaces, athletic fields, and public gathering places. The Mayans also engaged in extensive metalworking with gold and copper, and developed a complex hieroglyphic writing system that was only fully deciphered in the last century. Archaeologists estimate that the system of writing was created between 200 and 300 BC, which is earlier than initially thought. This shows that we're still learning about the Mayan civilization, and much of its history, culture, and daily life is still shrouded in mystery today. What we've gleaned comes from inscriptions, archaeological finds, and their only 4 surviving codices, as well as books written on paper made from wild fig trees held together by jaguar skin covers, because even Mayan books were badass. By the way, there are only 4 codices in existence because the Spanish destroyed most of the books when they found them upon arrival, decrying them as pagan. However, unlike most ancient Western Hemisphere civilizations, the Mayans were not brought down by the Spanish. The golden age of Mayan civilization was between 250 AD and 900 AD. If you were paying any attention during your high school history class, you might notice that 900 AD was long before the Spanish and English started colonizing the, quote, New World. Understanding what may have led to the collapse of the Mayan civilization means understanding the Mayans themselves. During the peak of their civilization, the Mayans made astounding advances in astronomy, architecture, and their calendar systems. In fact, the Mayans had one of the most complicated calendar systems in the world, based partly on their very accurate understanding of astronomy. They had 2 simultaneous calendars, one divided into 18 months of 20 days, and another, known as the long count calendar, divided into units called baktun. The latter told us the world was supposed to end in 2012. Perhaps not shockingly, the calendar itself never actually said that, but a whole bunch of people for whom the apocalypse can't come soon enough interpreted it that way. What the long count calendar does say is that the full cycle of creation consisted of 13 baktun, and the very last one of those would end on December 21st, 2012. However, this doesn't necessarily mean the collapse of the world as we know it. First of all, it's past 2012. The world's still here, though admittedly, it's not in the best state. Second of all, the Mayans had even longer units of measurement that counted millions of years and extended past the 2012 date. In addition to their surprisingly accurate contributions to calendar systems, they built glorious pyramids, some of which remain at sites like Chichen Itza, Tikal, Palenque, and Tulum, if you can even get to the latter through the throngs of Instagram influencers on the local beaches. Some of these pyramids were actually related to the Mayans' astronomical research. At the top of the pyramid at Chichen Itza, for example, there is a dome-shaped structure known as El Caracol that almost looks like a modern observatory. Though to our knowledge no telescope was housed there, the dome seems to have been perfectly aligned with the movements of Venus. It also provided a way for astronomers and religious figures of the day to get clear views of the sky, perched high above the canopy of the thick jungles of Central America. Part of the reasons the Mayans were so intent on accurately cataloging the movements of planets and stars is that they believed the movements of celestial bodies were intricately connected to the desires and the actions of the gods. As noted before when discussing the calendar system, the Mayans believed that life and time were a series of cycles. In fact, according to the Popol Vuh, a book that tells a lot of their mythology, the creation of man was also the result of a few cycles. Initially, humans were constructed out of mud and earth. As you can imagine from this structurally unsound combination, they quickly crumbled. The second cohort was built out of wood, but this too proved to be unsuitable, and they were washed away, presumably in one of the region's frequent tropical storms. So what ingredients finally did the trick and created the modern-day humans? Well, according to their mythology, the humans that finally became the Mayans were made out of maize, which should give you an idea of just how important that crop was to Mayan society. The Mayans valued many goods very differently from what we would expect in the modern day. For example, the gold of the area, something the Spanish would literally kill for centuries later, was only important for jewelry and religious items. Besides that, gold had no real monetary value in the Mayan world. They didn't even use coins. Instead, they preferred to trade and barter various goods with neighboring groups of people. Even when it came to precious metals and gemstones, jade was valued much more than gold. However, gold was used in religious rituals, which sometimes involved, yeah, you guessed it, human sacrifice. In the Mayan world, there was a kind of heaven with 13 different layers and an underworld known as Xibalba, with 9 different layers, each ruled by a death lord that the souls of the dead had to pass through before ascending to heaven. It sounded, quite frankly, like a horrible journey. Maybe that's why the beliefs of the time allowed for a shortcut to getting not only into heaven, but supreme heaven, i.e. the top layer. This was reserved for those killed in sacrifice, either for religious reasons or at the ball court, we'll get to that later, and women who died in childbirth. Thus, the benefit of becoming a sacrifice seemed to be that you got to teleport straight to winning against the equivalent of the Afterworld's final video game boss. The drawback was that you would be painted blue, have a headdress put on you, have 4 men hold you down to represent the cardinal directions while your heart was removed, and then be decapitated, often after being extensively tortured. This would usually happen at the summit of a temple for maximum visibility, both to other Mayans and to the gods, for whom the sacrifice was the gift, a great blood offering. Other animals were sacrificed as well, but the blood of humans was considered the ultimate honor. Some of the events that merited human sacrifice included the dedication of a new temple or the rise of a new ruler. Others involved losing an apparently very high-stakes ball game. Athletic fields have been discovered in Mayan cities in the shape of a capital I. At least one in Chichen Itza is bigger than the length of a modern football field. The game was not just for fun and sport. Like many things in Mayan culture, it was intricately connected to Mayan spiritual beliefs. It's supposedly based on a game that 2 of the most important Mayan spiritual figures, brothers by the name of Hunhunakpu and Xabalanque, played while they were still on Earth, and it signifies the battle between the forces of light and darkness. Only the right hip, right elbow, and right knee were allowed to make contact with the ball, and the ball itself, weighing approximately 6 to 9 pounds or 3 to 4 kilograms, could never touch the floor. The 2 teams would consist of 2 to 6 players each, and the goal was for the offensive team to get the ball back to the defensive team, preferably through a tiny, and we mean tiny, stone ring in the middle of the court, at the top of the border wall, while the defense's goal was to make the offensive team drop the ball. We're not sports specialists, but one team's job seems significantly easier than the other. You might be wondering where human sacrifice comes into all this. Well, quite a few historians believe that the losing team may have been ritually killed in those games, or in their place, a captured lord or king. Others believe this aspect of the ball game was exaggerated, and perhaps a captive or 2 may have been killed at the end of the game, but they were people who would have likely been sacrificed anyway. Either way, it is clear that the ball game held a very important religious significance for Mayan society, and courts for those games have been found throughout the former reaches of the Mayan civilization. This relatively unified mythology may give the impression that the Mayans functioned as one strong empire. However, the reality was that the civilization was split into units, akin to the Greek city-states that would sometimes fight for control. Each city of the Mayan Empire had a local ruler known as an ahau, though some cities bucked the trend of autocracy. Seren, for example, was a village located in present-day El Salvador and buried around 600 AD in a volcanic eruption. Archaeologists working in the area found no evidence of an elite ruling class and instead believe the village was set up communally. In other words, the hippies of the Mayan world. That being said, godlike rulers seem to be the norm throughout the region, and some of them, like Pacal of Palenque, were buried inside their very own dedicated pyramids. Pacal was entombed with precious items like jade, funerary masks, and, of course, the bodies of 5 or 6 human sacrifices alongside him. Apparently, the phrase "everyone dies alone" did not apply to Mayan rulers. One of the most well-known and powerful Mayan cities at the time, centuries before it became known as the home of Señor Frogs and American college students disappointing their parents, was Cancun. Various archaeological finds have confirmed that Cancun's status as a wealthy Mayan city extended up to 800 AD, though little remains from the society after that date. One of the last intricately carved panels depicting the ruler of Cancun has been dated to 795 AD. This is where we can start investigating how the Mayan civilization collapsed, as Cancun gives us one possible reason. Archaeologists have determined that around the year of Cancun's seeming collapse, the city was attacked. Evidence of mass violence has been found, including 38 separate bodies showing signs of violent, brutal trauma that died around that year. Whoever attacked Cancun massacred the royal family and buried them, along with their jewelry. Could the Mayan Empire have collapsed as a result of attacks? And who were the attackers? Well, some cities may have met their fate that way, but there's more to this story than meets the eye. You see, there are signs that the power of the Mayans was waning way before their empire mysteriously disappeared. The collapse itself didn't happen overnight, and the civilization likely fell over a period of 100 years, with various areas affected at different times. However, in some locations, it truly does seem like the local inhabitants just got up and left one day. For example, in the ancient city of Bonampak, one of the buildings has gorgeous murals adorning its walls. Though the murals start with the local Lahau winning a glorious battle around the year 791, at some point the artwork just stops. There are half-finished sketches on one relatively blank part of the mural, still visible today, indicating that the artists were still working on it and planning to complete it, but instead they just left. Aguateca, located in Guatemala, has a similar eerie building within its borders. Builders and artists were constructing a temple, but at some point it became obvious they were either called away, left, or slaughtered in the middle of their work. Part of the temple stela had been smoothed, indicating they were about to be covered with the usual detailed carvings found in Mayan temples. But these carvings never materialized. Strangely enough, archaeologists also found evidence that in the years before the temple was mysteriously abandoned, the people of Aguateca had built additional defensive structures, like palisades and other fortifications. Could it be that they were threatened? Had an invader leveled neighboring cities and put them on edge? This phenomenon was observed throughout the area the Mayan civilization covered, not just in a few select cities. The collapse seemed to start around Patesh Batun and then continued across the Usumacinta River. Scribes stopped recording history, artists stopped making sculptures, and buildings and artwork were left half-finished. The strange thing is that the Mayans themselves didn't disappear. Their descendants still live in Mexico and Central America to this day, speaking Mayan languages, most often in addition to the Spanish later imposed on them by colonizers. An estimated 7 million people identify as Mayans living throughout Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, parts of Honduras, and of course the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, as well as other parts of the country. In fact, there are approximately 750,000 to 1.2 million Mayan speakers in the Yucatan alone. The number of people with Mayan surnames and ancestry is 3 times as high, though many may not speak Mayan anymore, especially as a first language. Mexico's National Institute of Geography and Informatics estimates that 60% of the Yucatan state's population speaks Mayan. Additionally, approximately 42% of Guatemala's population is of Mayan descent, and unfortunately, they tend to experience a fair amount of discrimination from the state. So if the actual people are still here, what in the world happened to their civilization and cities? How did it all disappear? Clearly, they weren't completely ethnically cleansed or wiped out by disease, though the Spanish did later introduce the remaining Mayans to smallpox, which decimated a fair number of them, or any of the other horrible fates that can and have befallen indigenous populations. Well, here are some theories about the demise of the mighty Mayan Empire and why some cities seem to show evidence of brutal attacks. First, historians believe overpopulation may have contributed to the collapse of Mayan cities. The biggest Mayan city at the time, Tikal, reached a population of approximately 50,000 inhabitants at the beginning of the 9th century. This may seem like nothing compared to the billions upon billions of people currently crowding our planet. After all, to use a regional point of comparison, Guatemala City currently has a population of just under 1 million people. However, with resources and agricultural practices available to them, 50,000 people concentrated in one city would have put a huge strain on resources. The Mayans likely would have struggled to produce enough food to feed everyone in their population, leading to discontent, famine, and people seeking food to sustain themselves elsewhere, most likely in the countryside. Another theory about the disappearance of the Mayan civilization lends even more credence to this one. It explains why the fall of the Mayan cities happened relatively quickly in some areas. Researchers have found evidence of a massive and widespread drought in the lowlands around the Mayan cities at the beginning of the 9th century, which, if you recall, is the same time that the Mayan population reached its peak. Cambridge University researcher Nicholas Evans and his team analyzed sediment cores from Lake Chichén Canab in the Yucatan Peninsula, located within the lands of the Mayan civilization. They gave some great insights into the climate during the classical period of the Mayans. By examining oxygen and hydrogen isotopes in the sediments, Evans and his team found that the Mayans not only experienced a prolonged drought during the time of their collapse, but also intermittent prolonged droughts over a period of 400 years. Soil analysis shows that annual rainfall decreased by 41 to 54% for long periods during the 400-year time span. This is significant because it also shows why the Mayans may have struggled to build up food reserves to buffer themselves against prolonged periods of drought if they'd already faced several periods of low water supply. Unfortunately, the drought was likely partly caused by the Mayans' own practices, especially the final one that led to civilization's collapse. Mayan farmers practiced slash and burn agriculture, meaning that in order to grow the quantities of maize they needed to support an expanding population, they had to tear down a significant amount of surrounding forest. Trees were also used as fuel and construction materials. This deforestation likely caused a form of climate change in the immediate vicinity, with rising temperatures due to the lack of trees available to absorb atmospheric gases and much lower rainfall in the area. A drought like this would have exacerbated any existing food insecurity in the region and led to a lack of work for farmers, a lack of food for citizens, and generalized discontent. In turn, this could have easily contributed to not only Mayan subjects fleeing in search of food, but perhaps rebelling against their rulers for failing to secure better living conditions. This is where Mayan beliefs and culture also come into play. After all, the Pharaohs and the ruling class were often connected to divinity and partly in charge of keeping the gods pleased in order to provide a good life for the people under their command. If the Mayans saw their food sources dwindling and nothing happening to stop it, they may have concluded that their local Pharaohs were not doing their jobs or had displeased the gods in some way. This also raises the possibility that the hastily abandoned Mayan cities may not have all been attacked by outsiders. Some may have been deserted as the result of rebellions from their own populations, which would remove the need for commemorative artwork in temples for the area's rulers, as they would have probably been among the first killed. However, the existence of additional defensive fortifications in some Mayan cities also points to some threat of outside interference. According to some historians, this could be evidence of attacks or the threat of attacks from other Mayan cities, not necessarily an entirely foreign force. The drought and food shortages could have caused increased infighting, with the state of warfare causing the availability of supplies to dwindle even further. Historians have discovered texts from the 9th century that mention conflicts between cities more frequently than usual. Archaeologists have unearthed panels depicting captured enemies and listing the names of the rulers defeated in battle. While various Mayan cities were at war with each other, the movement of troops and various skirmishes would have likely blocked trade routes, not to mention the ability of cities to trade with each other if they were at war. For the Mayan economy, which was heavily based on barter and trade, this would have been especially devastating, drastically decreasing the number of supplies that people could obtain to help their society function. In turn, this would likely spur some rulers to attack more neighboring cities in search of additional supplies for their own population. Thus, it's likely that a population peak, coupled with drought and food shortages exacerbated by warfare, worked together to quickly destroy the mighty Mayan cities. However, these are not the only theories on the table. These theories are somewhat weakened by the idea that certain Mayan cities, Chichen Itza and Uxmal for example, continued to flourish for about 150 years after their sister cities had fallen. Then these cities of the north of the Yucatan Peninsula mysteriously collapsed relatively quickly. So what caused two collapses to occur about a century and a half apart? Well, into the 10th century, reliefs and inscriptions on the walls of the palace and other buildings of Uxmal show scenes of warfare and human sacrifice. Someone was around to carve them and fight in the wars, so it seems that Uxmal, though at war, was still present. In fact, the impressive governor's palace in Uxmal, which remains in the area today, was built in the 10th century. This leads historians to believe that Uxmal was not only surviving at the time but thriving. In the 11th century, the same fate started to befall Uxmal and many surrounding cities of the former northern part of the Mayan Empire. New constructions and monuments were left half-finished, and the entire area around Uxmal, known as Puuk, was completely depopulated. This occurred around the same time as Chichen Itza continued to expand, but it too was eventually abandoned. No one really has a good idea as to why that happened. Perhaps the northern cities experienced less severe drought. Perhaps with the depopulated southern cities, they could source more supplies for their people and sustain themselves for a few decades. Perhaps, as some voices on the internet suggest, the Mayans were visited by aliens who ended their civilization and then they made a return trip. It seems likely that in the long term, the Mayans' agricultural and environmental practices were simply unsustainable and not conducive to supporting an ever-expanding population increasingly concentrated in urban centers. Though we still don't know exactly what happened to the Mayans, a combination of man-made drought, overpopulation, warfare, and political instability seem to be the most likely culprits for what brought the once mighty civilization to its knees. The good news is, we never have to worry about things like that leading to the doom of a society ever again. Today, many descendants of the Mayans preserve ancient rituals, customs, modes of dress, farming practices, traditional jewelry making, and even their ancestors' last names. So, in certain ways, Mayan culture continues onwards, long after the civilization itself collapsed. Unfortunately, many indigenous descendants of the Mayans are heavily discriminated against in the countries in which they live, in ways that are often violent. During the 36-year-long Guatemalan Civil War, which ended in 1996, the victims of assault and murder were disproportionately Mayan.
What if a whole region the size of a small country slowly sank beneath the sea, hiding what were once hills and forests and fertile lands that people had inhabited successfully for thousands of years? It sounds like the start of a new fantasy novel, but as it turns out, that really has happened. And not only that, it's happened more than once in rapid succession, geologically speaking. At the peak of the last ice age about 20,000 years ago, sea levels around the world were much lower than today. But coastal areas are often a good place for human settlement, offering a ready source of protein from fish and shellfish. So some of the very sites where people might have chosen to live are precisely the places that were about to be inundated, and hence hard for scientists to find. The Black Sea region is one of the richest in terms of potential for the archaeological study of early civilizations, but part of the story seems to be missing. In Turkey, Greece, and the Valley of the Danube, there are apparent gaps right around the time when people started adopting farming as a way of life. That era, the Neolithic, or New Stone Age, is a major turning point in the story of humanity. Archaeologists need artifacts from transitional sites to understand how the shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture took place. But first, they need to find them, and the part of this region with the best remains of early farming villages may currently be at the bottom of the Black Sea. At the end of the last ice age, the Black Sea was a huge freshwater lake, although its shorelines were much lower than today. A thin land bridge kept out the salt water of the Mediterranean. According to one theory, as the level of the Mediterranean rose, it put pressure on this thin natural dam, eventually creating a waterfall 200 times as big as Niagara Falls. Some researchers have conjectured that oral histories of that catastrophe inspired the ancient flood narratives, like the story of Noah or Gilgamesh. However, the Black Sea flooding may not have been as sudden or voluminous as suggested by the broken dam theory, and it might have come from the Caspian Sea instead, a different direction altogether. No matter where they came from, fast or slow, floods would have been bad news for Neolithic farmers near the Black Sea, but they could be a boon to archaeologists. The depths of the Black Sea have very low oxygen levels, and in those conditions, organic materials you'd expect to find in a Neolithic village, wood, fibers, animal skins, stand a comparatively good chance of preservation. The trouble is figuring out where to dive, a problem shared by underwater archaeology in several other regions. Modern surveying technologies can help, but apparently so too can lobsters. In 1999, a team of marine archaeologists were surveying near the Isle of Wight on Britain's southern coast. There they noticed that local lobsters had done some digging of their own. Burrowing down into the seafloor, the crustaceans had excavated a number of Stone Age flint tools. Subsequent expeditions found additional sites at the underwater formation known as Boulder Cliff. The site dates from more than 8,000 years ago, when the area was still dry land, and researchers have found evidence at Boulder Cliff of very early boat building and long-distance trade. A map of northern Europe during the Ice Age of the Late Pleistocene looks quite unfamiliar compared to the modern coastline. For one thing, Great Britain was a peninsula rather than an island. Even more dramatic is what's right next to it, a landmass the size of a whole country in the middle of the North Sea. Dubbed Doggerland, the region joined Britain with the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. Then, as the often icy Pleistocene gave way to the warmer Holocene, it disappeared. Mapping the North Seafloor has shown the river valleys and hills of the forgotten country. In its time a fertile region, undersea exploration at Doggerland may hold clues to the lives of Northern Europe's earliest farmers. Since 1931, artifacts found at sea or washed ashore have hinted at the habitation of this lost land. Recent exploration has shown that it was no mere land bridge, and in fact, Doggerland had vast areas suited to human settlement. Although the inundation of water was often too slow to observe in a single lifetime, there were exceptions. 3 massive underwater landslides took place off the coast of Norway about 8,000 years ago. These landslides caused massive tsunami waves, which would have devastated what was left of Doggerland. But even if the islands had been able to recover from that disaster, the inexorable rise of the sea would have always meant doom for Doggerland was unavoidable. And it was far from the only ancient place to meet this fate. Numerous other lost countries lie on shallow continental shelves around the world. Beringia is the name for a region that once connected both Alaska and Siberia. It may have sustained human populations for thousands of years during the last ice age. As glaciers receded, one theory suggests ancestors of American Indians began migrating south along North America's Pacific coast. On the opposite side of the planet, Sundaland is the name scientists have given to a landmass, basically its own continent, that included the islands of Sumatra, Java, and Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula. Just to the east of that was the ancient continent of Sahul, which included both Australia and New Guinea. Sundaland and Sahul had populations of modern human beings for some 50,000 years, meaning that artifacts of human habitation also lie in the ocean off Indonesia and Malaysia. Like the Black Sea, a very compelling lost land yet to explore is the so-called Gulf Oasis. In the Pleistocene, this was a lush land of rivers and a huge freshwater lake, which would one day become the modern Persian Gulf, also called the Arabian Gulf or just the Gulf. The region shows a spike in human settlement starting around 9,000 years ago. That implies an influx of people, possibly including groups moving to higher ground, as the lake became a rising salt sea. The Persian Gulf could harbor early sites of enormous significance to the history of civilization. Right now, the oldest known cities are from the Sumerian civilization of southern Iraq, near the delta where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet the Gulf. Down the coast to the south and east, excavations in the island country of Bahrain have revealed the civilization of Dilmun, named for a semi-mythical paradise in Sumerian religion and history. Possibly inspired by their connections to the region, Dilmun features in the Sumerian creation myths as a place bestowed with fresh water. An intriguing theory suggests that some of the predecessors of Sumeria and Dilmun were migrants from lower altitude lands that were flooded as salt water from the ocean encroached onto the large freshwater lakes and rivers. Considering the importance of the region in technological breakthroughs ranging from the origin of writing, the invention of the wheel, to the planting of wheat and the brewing of beer, new major chapters of world history or even dramatic changes to what we think we know about the origins of human civilization may await discovery at the bottom of the Gulf. This lost country may even be one of the first places occupied by modern humans outside of Africa. Thus far, underwater archaeology in the region has been limited, so for now this ancient paradise, if it existed, still awaits discovery. But there are plenty of sites where underwater archaeology is happening, and a pair of sites on the Mediterranean hints at the possibilities for this field of study in the future. Mapping the shallow seafloor off the coast of southern Greece, archaeologists have worked with artists to put together a picture of a thriving ancient community from a time long before Homer. The researchers call the town Pavlopitri, although its ancient name remains a mystery. Similar work is being done off the coast of Israel, where archaeologists have been studying a village called Atlit Yam. Preserved much as it was when the residents seem to have abandoned it 9,000 years ago, the people of Atlit Yam may have led quite a good life, raising various crops and animals, and of course fishing in the sea just beside their community. They lived long lives for the era and buried their dead with offerings. They even built a megalithic structure that kind of resembles Stonehenge. Its function isn't clear, but it may have been associated with a fresh water source. The remains of several stone wells at the Atlit Yam hold clues to its likely downfall. In succession, each well became converted to a trash pit, likely because it stopped producing fresh water. And of course, the salt water kept coming until it reached its modern coastline a quarter-mile away. As archaeologist Ehud Galili noted to the Jerusalem Post, right now Atlit Yam is the best preserved village from its time in the Mediterranean, and for thousands of years the structures and artifacts were protected under the sands. But he adds that as modern sea levels rise and shift the sands on the seafloor, sites like Atlit Yam face the risk of being lost forever.
Century 21, December 24. It's more deadly than smallpox, scarier than Ebola, and more transmissible than any virus scientists have ever seen. Still, those that know, and there are few of them, know very little about it yet. Disease X, as it's named, seems to be a viral infection of the brain, but it's also very unique. These are the notes of Dr. Jonas Fester of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, written on Christmas Eve 2022. This is before there are any cases in the U.S., with the first patient seemingly coming from the country of Thailand. Dr. Thitiporn Bangsabat of Thailand's Department of Disease Control reported a number of cases in Chiang Mai in the north of Thailand. The infected patients come from a large psychiatric hospital named Swan Prajau, the Garden of God. There were over 3,000 patients in total at the hospital, mostly from the north, but also other areas of Thailand. All infected patients plus staff were contained in one ward. The doors were bolted. There were bars on the windows. 27 patients were on the ward, all were infected, plus 3 staff. Patients suffering from various conditions, including psychosis, major depressive disorder, paranoid schizophrenia, uncomplicated and complicated drug withdrawal, and delirium tremens.
2 of the alcohol patients were strapped to gurneys. Dr. Fester wipes the sweat from his brow as he looks at the report. He's never read anything quite so disturbing. When the outbreak occurred, or at least when symptoms started to show, the patients were locked in the ward. Fester tries to imagine the scene in the hospital. The initial symptoms were vomiting and confusion as well as headache. This progressed to hallucinations in patients not previously diagnosed with psychosis or suffering from severe alcohol withdrawal. Patients were feverish, after which excitability progressed to anger, as Thitiporn explained, a kind of fury the doctors had not seen in their mental patients. The patients subsequently attacked each other in what seemed like delirious states of mind. Some suffered serious injuries, including possible broken bones, losing eyes as they were gouged out, and lacerations to the skin, face, and trunk, all due to scratching and biting, since no viable weapons were available on the ward. Doctors tried to communicate with the patients, which proved impossible. It also seemed the patients had lost the ability to speak and possibly hear. Fester knows that during the acute phase of encephalitis, patients can become aggressive and have been known to cause harm to others, but the psychiatric problems displayed in Thailand were extreme and entirely unique, as was the seeming hypertransmissibility of the virus. If the encephalitis was viral, thinks Fester, nothing in medical literature can explain what happened in the ward, if what happened was encephalitis. The symptoms of aggression could have possibly been explained as a form of mass psychosis if the patients hadn't fallen into a coma. All of the patients died after the 7th day, although some were killed during the violence that erupted. Fester writes that it's unknown how the contagion spreads or how long it takes from transmission to onset of symptoms. All staff at the hospital, he writes, are now in quarantine. Biohazard suits are worn during the removal of bodies and subsequent autopsies. Day 28. This is how it started. A pandemic that in time will be referred to by the public as the zombie virus. It will remain Disease X within the medical community, with its origins being unknown for a long time. It's presently suspected to be a product of genetic engineering, possibly a bioweapon used for bioterrorism. No one has laid claim to this as yet. Scientists do have some idea, thanks to autopsies, about the effects the virus has on the brain. Patients first become ill, with all patients experiencing vomiting. This, in part, could explain the fast transmission rates, since many of the patients vomited on each other and their surroundings. Then comes catastrophic loss of brain function, affecting cognitive functions first. In the autopsies, the patient's sensory cortex and hippocampus showed considerable damage. This likely resulted in auditory and visual hallucinations. The amygdala, as with much of the limbic system, becomes hyperexcitable. It's thought this creates an intense automatic rage response in the patients to any kind of stimulus. The recently discovered Bieber complex associated with the brain's so-called rage circuits also showed abnormalities. Moreover, frontal lobe damage explains why patients are profoundly disinhibited to the point of derangement. Damage to the temporal lobe can explain the resultant loss of speech, recognition, and short-term memory. It seems that the virus is airborne and likely transmissible from surfaces. It's believed that at first the host's immune system doesn't recognize the virus, so it moves toward the person's central nervous system without causing any initial symptoms. It's thought that patients can remain asymptomatic after transmission for possibly 9 to 12 days. It then replicates at an astonishing rate in nerve cells, eventually reaching the brain. After traveling to the peripheral and autonomic nervous systems, it gets into the salivary glands, from where it's transmitted to the next person. The excitotoxicity of the brain eventually leads to seizures followed by paralysis, coma, and death. So far, it's untreatable and has a 100% fatality rate. Day 155. The most lethal pathogen the world has ever seen almost definitely originated in a lab, but which lab is unknown. Scarier still, infected people are now turning up all over the world, always in small pockets. It's as if it's being transported to specific areas. Some government officials in the US have been talking within their circle and blaming China, saying patient zero was perhaps not of Thai origin but coming from its neighbor. Still, no one who is at the mental hospital in Chiang Mai, so far at least, can be connected with someone who had recently traveled to China. Since the virus shows no symptoms at first and then leads to rapid destruction of the patient's brain, not much information could be gathered from them. The major problem is that no test has yet been created to detect the virus in its early stages. Scientists are able to hypothesize its pathogenesis, development in the body, but do not understand the nature of its stealth. It remains chimeric, and even the most advanced electron microscopy has so far failed to isolate it. Day 180. With seemingly impossible long-distance airborne dispersal and its hypertransmissibility, a chosen selection of top scientists who'd been given the data are saying they're more or less sure it's someone or some country engineering a perfect killing machine. Whoever did this wants to destroy civilization. Even so, the public for the most part has not been extensively informed. Where the virus has hit, the areas have been quickly contained and news suppressed as much as possible. The governments of the world that have been properly informed about the virus understand the public panic that will surely arise if the virus is explained in full. That is, a rabies-like rage virus that has perhaps been designed to have the transmission traits of the common flu. Explaining this to the public would throw the entire world into chaos. Information has leaked, though albeit with mixed, vague narratives. This hasn't stopped the media from printing what would usually be hyperbolic headlines designed to attract hits through fear. The Daily Mail in the UK recently ran the headline, "New Zombie Virus Has Scientists Baffled." An online article right next to it titled, "Kim Kardashian?" featured photos of the celebrity's new cosmetic surgery catastrophe, has way more hits. That same day, the Sun newspaper ran the headline, "Apocalypse Ni Hao. China is hiding a top-secret zombie virus." The Sun story was also overshadowed by Kardashian's surgery story, which has provided the governments of the world with some relief. Outside of the tabloid media, the next story mentioned in passing is a conspiracy theory. The New York Times wrote, "What next? Reddit becomes hub for zombie virus misinformation." Day 234. A young man named Dwayne Brady has just been released from isolation at California's San Quentin prison. The so-called monster of Mountain View, a genius some say, is taking responsibility for the zombie virus, now talked about extensively in all media. The Times has changed its tune about being a conspiracy theory. Brady is a recently arrested serial killer who, while working in Google's brain team department, stalked top executives in the Mountain View area of California and murdered them, 16 in all. After secretly drugging them, he'd take them back home and perform brain surgery on them, implanting devices into various parts of the brain in an attempt to create a neural interface. All of them, of course, died, including Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, who Brady later joked had his first taste of the metaverse. Brady was also quick to add he definitely was human, though. Brady believed he was on the cusp of creating a brain-machine interface more advanced than anyone had previously imagined. But an investigation revealed that while he was an intelligent man with an IQ of 158, he was also completely insane. The authorities said his human brain interface amounted to nothing but torture and was totally useless to science. It just so happened that the first cases of Disease X in the US happened at San Quentin. It struck like lightning, and even though a full lockdown was implemented after the first attacks, it was too late. Infected prisoners lunged at each other in their cells, tearing out eyes and biting the flesh off each other's faces, just as happened in Thailand. The entire prison was closed, but before that, most of the 3,000 prisoners were dead, as well as scores of staff. Only some prisoners in isolation cells survived. One of them was Brady, a prisoner on death row. After the bodies were removed from the prison, he and other survivors were put in quarantine and interviewed. That's when Brady claimed that he invented the virus, but pretty much anything else he said was delusional and sometimes nonsensical. Brady said he was the second coming told by God to rid the world of most of its people, who for too long had embraced evil and greed. Tech executives were at the top of the pile. But the question remained, how did it get into the prison? San Quentin employed hundreds of correctional officers and hundreds more free staff, and thousands of prisoners had been visited during the time frame the virus could have infected the first person. Day 300. On a wall outside New York City's Grand Central Terminal, someone has written the words of the now deceased biochemist Wendell Meredith Stanley. If a killing type of virus strain should suddenly arise by mutation, it could, because of the rapid transportation in which we indulge nowadays, be carried to the far corners of the earth and cause deaths of millions of people. The vandal has crossed out the M in million and added a B for billions. The street, usually packed with people, is silent. New York City is deadly quiet except one street corner. A man with an unkempt appearance is preaching to no one in particular. Newspapers below him on the sidewalk are whipped by the wind, each with weeks-old headlines, occasionally upturned, exposing such words as rage virus, still unknown, panic, power grid. Reading from the Book of Revelations, the man shouts, "And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them, and they were judged, every man according to their works." He stops for a second, looks around, and then screams, "Behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him." Year 2. It has been decided that due to ethical reasons, all prisoners in the U.S. must be released. There is now no staff to run the prisons. Dwayne Brady is now a free man. He's just moved into a house where an entire family has perished. How he hasn't contracted the virus himself is a mystery. Lockdowns are not working, masks are not working for the most part, people stay huddled indoors, their groceries being delivered by specially trained delivery officers. The people still going out to work are more than just essential, they're the ones who, if they don't work, society would collapse. Medical staff, power grid workers, water treatment facility workers, and importantly, the people who keep the computer servers running. Who would have thought that the metaverse would have been so useful? Much of the most essential work can be done remotely. But anarchy is happening in the streets. A large segment of society believes the virus is the work of a secret underground government, a new world order, which has decided to drastically depopulate the planet. There are militias walking in the streets, heavily armed in countries where guns are widespread. Some towns in Alabama, though, look pretty much the same. In the US, these army militias live together, forming what looks like cults, often taking what they want with the help of their powerful firearms. In the UK, such gangs are even seen walking around with swords and clubs. Houses are burning, government buildings are burning. Today in the UK's north, a street battle takes place between two groups, the National Defence League, NDL, and the Leeds Headhunters. Each of these gangs will contract the virus at some point and members will turn on each other. Society's on the brink of collapse, all over the globe. Year 3. Those that survive are the ones with enough money to live in underground bunkers. The few people out on the streets live each day in peril. People are now effectively hunters and gatherers, a regression to a distant past. The ones that can best survive are the few who never really stopped being hunters and gatherers, small societies that are nomadic or live in small groups far from the rest of society. The population of India, now less than 60 million. China doesn't have many more people. The US is down to 3 million. Australia is a wasteland, and there are survivors who live on some of the country's most inhabitable areas. During the initial stages of the pandemic, the US president lived in a bunker under the White House called the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. Life there wasn't sustainable over a long period of time, so by using tunnels, he and his closest staff boarded a helicopter and flew to a series of enormous bunkers that were built years ago at Area 51. There are about 1,500 people here. Politicians, doctors, scientists, military, engineers, and also some of the wealthiest people in the US, despite some of them having no discernible skills. It's the same with the British royals and aristocracy, who collectively haven't yet managed to understand how to work the bunker's microwave ovens. Many other nations have selected people hidden in state-of-the-art bunkers. Various male and female animals are also kept on underground farms. From Area 51, the military remotely controls powerful drones that scan cities all over the US. Attack drones bomb or shoot any large groups of infected people, but take out those that are not infected too. The question is, do they launch a nuclear strike and wait for the dust to settle before venturing out to finish off the rest, thereby being able to reboot society with hopefully no virus around? After all, viruses can't live without hosts. The nuclear powers of the world talk in detail about launching their arsenal of weapons. There's no rush, though. There are enough vegetables and meat that can sustain life grown in underground labs and farms in the bunkers. Generating electricity is possible with solar, wind, water, steam, and even human poop. The outside world is now black at night, making survival for the few that are left difficult. The population now is in the tens of thousands. Year 4. Scientists are still no nearer to solving the mystery of where the virus came from. What's strange is that even though it seems to kill 99.99% of people, there are people alive that shouldn't be, including Dwayne Brady. While surveying the world outside, scientists hypothesize that a handful of people must have natural immunity. If only they could examine those people, they might be able to find out why they have immunity and create a vaccine. They've had their eyes on Brady, who has come into contact with the dying on a few occasions, at least before he had to shoot them. Year 5. They eventually do contact Brady and manage to get him to the bunker via a passenger drone. But it turns out he is a carrier of the disease, only he's asymptomatic. He infects a number of doctors who of course infect each other. Part of the bunker is soon covered in blood and bits of shorn flesh, but thankfully precautions have been taken that one section is closed off. Brady only survives by his wits, hiding until the devastation has stopped and all the infected are dead. On this day, he's pleading to the CCTV cameras to allow him into the village, the larger bunkers that house everyone. Now scientists understand that the people who remain outside could also be asymptomatic, carriers of the virus. This is bad news. They will need to stay in bunkers much longer. Year 2050. The survivors in the bunkers have been procreating for reasons of sustaining the human race. Such matchups are not based on any kind of attraction, but only on genetic diversity. Children are born into this underground life. The general term now used for all these survivors is the descendants. Everything they do, everything they write, everything they learn, in fact, all human knowledge they can summon, is written into a book called Legacy. If everyone does die, or most people at least, this book, bound in cast iron, might be found later. By humans, who knows, possibly by aliens. It contains all the knowledge and thoughts of every survivor in the world, being a collaborative effort between countries only possible because some computer servers can still function with the help of robots. There are many disagreements in the history part, but in the end, countries always come to an agreement. On the outside, the hunters and gatherers, now called the remnants, survive best they can. The survivors that live on the peripheries of the world are called the relics, although unfortunately at times, some of them get too close to towns outside their havens and unwittingly bring the virus back to their villages. Year 2150. Everyone that was around at the start of the pandemic is now dead. although children have been born to the remnants and the relics as well as the descendants. Those that survive are born into an era that's now referred to as the hard times. The question remains, how many infected are left outside of their safe havens? When the descendants leave the bunker this year, they begin to kill off all the remnants, assuming that they might be asymptomatic carriers. These descendants have state-of-the-art weaponry. The remnants do not. Year 2151. A long discussion between the descendants of the world about what to do with the relics starts. It's almost certain they are not carriers, but even if one of them is, it could lead to a disaster and the end of the human race. After months of deliberation, a new chapter in Legacy is added. This is called the Culling. All known relic survivors that are reachable are massacred during this year. At this point, the cities and towns of the world have become inhabited by wildlife. Some are almost totally reclaimed by magnificent forests. Bears walk through New York City. Large troops of monkeys live in apartment buildings in Tokyo. The oceans are teeming with fish. Birds nest in the hallways of what was once the British Parliament buildings. There have been massive oil spills, though, as well as chemical leaks and nuclear explosions. The world, as it is for the descendants, is one marked by danger. Food is not much of a problem, even though not much remained of what was once cattle. They get their meat by hunting, and at least the new world is rich with vegetation, some of it edible. Year 2201. Many of the cities as people knew them were flooded a long time ago. Now rivers run through major streets, with crocodiles in some places living in what used to be subway stations. The abundance of water has eroded metal structures, with many roads and buildings having already collapsed. Many bridges all over the world no longer stand. In France, the Eiffel Tower is now the Eiffel Stump. A descendant actually made that joke. Some cities have been razed. Wildfires have started by the abundance of twigs and leaves hit with strikes of lightning. The surviving artifacts are now mainly the strongest stone structures, but many of them are hidden in the growth. Some places like Las Vegas are shrouded in the sand. For the first time in thousands of years, elephants and rhinoceroses are now seen on the continent of Europe. These animals, as well as the abundance of other fauna that's spread into places where it hasn't been in a long time, pose a danger to the descendants, and some former cities are now no-go areas. The descendants become scavengers of technology, taking what's still useful from the past. None of these descendants know what it would have been like to live in what they call the old world, but thanks to Legacy, they have sufficient knowledge to build and create. They understand things like cultural values. They know about wars and what it was like to have a life with incredible comfort. They can understand what humans back then would have considered their natural rights, such as a warm meal, a comfortable bed, and a day that isn't considered survival. These descendants have decided that after the culling, they should not harm each other, ever, if they are to have a chance to build a new world. The old world, they say, was built on greed and consumerism. The new world, they say, should have its foundations built on love and security. They understand what war means, but it makes no sense to them at all. Year 2301. The Second New World War has just finished, and it's wiped out much of the population. How did this happen? For the most part, a schism occurred where two large groups of descendants disagreed about various interpretations of Legacy. One man, a descendant in England named James Harris, decided the most important person in Legacy was Dwayne Brady, now His Holiness to some. Harris says if Brady had been allowed back into the village, he would have shared his endless knowledge, but instead they killed him. Brady, says Harris, had been working on scientific solutions to what had been the most pressing human problems. They made him an outcast for killing people, when all he'd been doing was ridding the world of a hierarchy of tech oligarchs whose purpose was to enslave men to their products. Brady had explained to people that he was on a mission from God, but he was called crazy for that and persecuted. Brady wasn't a criminal, says Harris, but a genius who sacrificed himself for the greater good of mankind. He was the real hero of Legacy, hence Harris's groundbreaking work, The Book of Dwayne. Different societies have different takes. Some descendants in Asia believe a man named Thitiporn Bangsabat had been sent down to Earth to begin what they call the Rapture. This is how the Great Virus started, they say. How else could it have begun, they ask. In this interpretation, Brady is nothing but a minor character, albeit since he survived, it's written in some books he was the devil leading a force of dark angels, the other asymptomatics. During a dark period of the century, suspected Brady worshippers are hunted down like animals, tortured, and killed. The ones doing the killing, the so-called punishers of justice, say Brady was the reason for the culling, which was a massacre of the purest people on Earth, now called the Innocents in this interpretation. The Innocents are worshipped by some people who have chosen to live as the Innocents did, Puritans who have no time for new technologies. They believe they'll be saved when the next rapture happens, which is expected in year 2392. Year 2401. The last century was a century of wars, but this one is more peaceful. There are now at least 100 religions throughout the world, with thousands of denominations of those religions. The stories are vast and complex in their narratives, with countless beliefs having now been formed not specifically related to Legacy. The stories of Legacy, many people now believe, are a mere superstition. They say that people such as Brady might not have even existed and were written in legacy purely as metaphor. They say the same about the Great Plague of 2022. Balderdash, they say, nothing like that happened. Also, they say that humanity has much bigger things to think about, such as cooling of the Earth, which they say could lead to human extinction in the next 50 years. Year 2701. Much of the wildlife that was plentiful 1,000 years ago has become extinct due to hunting and habitat destruction. But in terms of social development, the world is a much better place. Brilliant technologies are making people's lives better, and there's little severe poverty left in the world of 3 billion people. It's a positive year indeed. And there's a reason people are calling this the golden era of human history. Civilization is finally back on its feet. Year 2702. 18-year-old Trevor, or Trev to his now deceased friends, is starving, literally. He's sick with disease. His lungs are poisoned, his legs are weak and scarred. He thinks he's the last man on Earth. There could be more, he knows that, but there won't be soon enough. Clutched between his fingers is a worn-out and partly burnt copy of Legacy he had stolen from school a while back. He keeps reading the same chapter over and over again. History, the tech explosion, 2000 onwards. Part of the text reads, "Just prior to the Great Plague of 2022, humans in general made some remarkable progress. The days of famine were almost over. And while poverty still existed in poorer areas of the world, most people had access to food and clean water. Life expectancy was over 75 in developed nations, although a more sedentary lifestyle and a proliferation of unhealthy food had led to a rise in certain diseases such as diabetes and coronary heart disease." Trevor smiles, exposing black, broken teeth. He puts a dirty finger over one line he's read multiple times. Nonetheless, the hard, brutal work that teenagers were forced to endure just a century earlier had become a thing of the past in most nations. Many of them lived in relative luxury compared to their forebears, spending sometimes hours a day watching videos on the YouTube platform. See Chapter 4. YouTube, Trevor mutters under his breath, as he looks outside his crumbling shack at the dust cloud that had once been a blue sky. Imagine, he thinks, having food, all kinds of food, available at the push of a button. Imagine spending so much time watching videos. He tries to think about what such videos would look like. In the year 2702, in the month of March, an asteroid hit the Earth. They knew it was coming, but were unable to do anything about it. It was more than 10 kilometers across, bigger than the one mentioned in Legacy that was said to have killed off the dinosaurs. It made contact with the Earth, traveling at around 30,000 miles per hour. Just a few hours after impact, the planet was turned into a living hell. Fire spread over great tracts of land. Cities crumbled. This set off a series of shockwaves and devastating earthquakes, creating in turn giant tsunamis that swallowed cities. The massive plumes of dust the impact created blocked out the sunlight, and soon the Earth was totally enveloped by a dark cloud. On the surface, anywhere close to the impact crater was a hellscape. Every last person died quickly. They had no chance at all. Ejecta from the blast, the stuff on Earth thrown into the air, came back down in flames, killing people far and wide. Cities burned, forests burned, and the oceans were contaminated. As time went on, all over the world, most of the vegetation was destroyed by the toxic dust. For a while, survivors ate what they could, but the food was never going to last. As temperatures dropped, acid rain fell from the sky. Without light for photosynthesis, animals and plants died out. Only the smaller animals that could get underground had a chance. Humans were not prepared. Their numbers fell until there was hardly anyone left. Trevor closes his eyes and tries to ignore the flames in the distance. He closes his ears to try to deafen the sound of toxic rain falling on his shack. If only, he thinks, if only he could somehow go back to the 2000s. He probably would go outside and dance under the magical branches of a blooming tree and marvel over the sublime beauty of a simple piece of fruit. Take off his clothes and let the warm wind massage his unscarred back. He'd go back inside and lie down on a soft bed with fluffy goose-down pillows and appreciate the peace and tranquility of life. Something then tickles his feet and brings him out of his sweet reverie. It's a cockroach. Another. These things are everywhere now. He grits his teeth and pounds it with his filthy blood-stained fist, smashing its disgusting exoskeleton into little viscous shards. God, he thinks, I hate this world, as he throws Legacy outside into the fire. It's hard work being an archaeologist, but you love that it takes you around the world. You're always discovering new and fascinating architectural finds from civilizations past, but nothing has prepared you for what you encounter in your current dig in Costa Rica. One of the biggest mysteries possible in archaeology is how ancient civilizations could create something so big, so perfectly constructed, that it would seem impossible to make by human hands. That's the mystery behind the massive stone spheres of Costa Rica. Imagine a mysterious collection of over 300 stone spheres, almost perfectly round, ranging from as small as a few centimeters in diameter to as wide as over 8 feet at their center. The smallest ones are light enough that you could probably play catch with them if they weren't priceless artifacts, the biggest weigh up to 16 tons, too heavy to move without powerful construction equipment. From the smallest to the largest, most are made from gabbro, a coarser version of basalt, but some are made from limestone and sandstone. To make them this uniform and this smooth, especially at the larger sizes, would take some heavy-duty equipment. But none of that equipment existed when testing indicates they were created between 300 and 1550 CE. That wasn't just before the age of construction equipment, it was largely before the age of modern machinery. When first discovered by modern archaeologists in the coastal region of Isla de Cano, they were completely puzzled. Not only could they not figure out how the massive stone spheres were made, they had no idea what they were used for, and neither do you. What use would a society have for giant smooth rocks that were too heavy to move? The site they were found in doesn't give you many clues. It's a big location that contains both a long-abandoned settlement and a burial ground. It was active during both the Agua Buena period from 300 to 800 CE and the later Chiriqui period from 800 to 1550 CE, which is believed to be the heyday of the Diki culture. That means most of these stones were made by civilizations that came and went before the Europeans arrived, so they're not going to be giving you any answers. All that's left of the civilization now is some architecture consisting of a pair of retaining walls and, of course, lots of spheres. The stones sat largely undisturbed for hundreds of years until progress came marching along. The United Fruit Company, one of the most powerful businesses in the world in the 1930s, was making inroads into the jungle so they could turn the land into banana plantations. They quickly ran into the hard spheres and found them very difficult to move out of the way. As more workers arrived, they were confused by these giant smooth rocks. They tried to move them out of the way with equipment, damaging them. They became convinced that they were a secret ancient way to store gold and tried to blow them up with dynamite. That worked to break them apart, but inside there was nothing but smooth stone. The spheres didn't give away their secrets easily, as the only information that could be gained from them was their age via stratigraphy, the study of sedimentation in rocks. But even that wasn't exact because the rocks had been moved many times. Before all the spheres could be destroyed by reckless workers, the government of Costa Rica stepped in. They protected the area as a key archaeological site and let scientists inspect them over the years to see if they could unlock their secrets. And that's where you come in. You're determined to find a theory that makes sense, but you're not the only one looking for those answers. Some of the world's best archaeologists are on site along with you, and everyone's got a wild and crazy theory for how the spheres were made and transported. The site is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and you'll be watched carefully to make sure you don't damage anything. You and your fellow scientists spend hours wandering around the site, looking at large and small spheres and gathering what clues you can. Now it's time to take the evidence you found and see if you can develop a theory about their creation that passes scientific muster. You and your fellow archaeologists begin talking over dinner, and it's clear that they've developed some wild theories. The man to your left starts talking. I think they were lifted here by aliens and planted in this civilization. Aliens who were capable of space travel could have this technology far beyond ours, making it easy for them to use tractor beams in their spaceships to lift stones far beyond what machinery could do on Earth. As for their purpose, they might be ancient religious artifacts from an alien civilization. They could be encoded with information that our human eyes can't process, and they might be waiting for the aliens to return to reclaim them for their true purpose. The table laughs. It's clear they're not buying the alien theory, but it's far from the only crazy idea going around the table. Another archaeologist speaks up. You know, these stones were right across the Atlantic Ocean from the rumored site of the lost continent of Atlantis. Perhaps they're remnants of that lost civilization, and they were crafted underwater and brought ashore by the cataclysm that destroyed it. They could have been constructed more easily underwater because buoyancy helps counteract gravity, and it's easier to move heavy things underwater. It's impossible for us to move them or figure out their purpose because they were never meant to be used on land. The table erupts in arguments against yet another wild theory, but they're not done yet. A man with a wild, bushy beard who you don't remember from the expedition, maybe he just wandered in for a hot meal, has his own theory. Sure, they're giant spheres to us, but what if they weren't so big for the people who created them? There were lots of legends in many cultures about ancient races of giants, from the Titans of Greece to the Nephilim of the Bible. What if these spheres were created long before the age of man, by giants for whom they were no bigger than marbles for us? They could have been playthings for them, left behind for us tiny humans to find and puzzle over something that was never meant for us. The table looks like it's about to riot at the ridiculous theories, but thankfully, the next ones are a little more logical, if still pretty out there. Alchemy was a common study in the ancient world, with scientists studying how to transform natural substances. A woman at the far end of the table says, "What if these spheres were constructed not by hard workers but by scientists who had figured out how to soften the material they're made of? That way they could be rolled and shaped by the workers easily, and when the treatment wore off they would harden into solid stone again for their purpose." It's a theory more grounded in science, but it's still not one you're willing to buy. There's one big problem. If such a compound existed to make it easy to shape stone, why isn't there more evidence of it, you ask? Perhaps they hid it well. Maybe the secret of the stones is encoded in the stones themselves. They could be printed on the surface of the stones using ciphers that only could be read by the people who built them. Or maybe they've hidden the secret in the center of the stone. A wild-eyed man jumps up from the table. Maybe we should break one open and find out what it holds. You have to explain that not only would that be very, very illegal, but you would be destroying a Costa Rican national treasure and damaging a World Heritage Site, both of which could send you to prison for a long time. But that's one of the few questions that's already been answered. There were many theories back when the spheres were discovered about the spheres holding secrets or treasures, and many were destroyed. But in the center, the explorers found nothing but solid stone. Some thought they might have been rolled around a small, solid object like a coffee bean, but even that was never found. That was a close call, and you can see the crowd needs to be calmed down. You decide to share some theories more grounded in evidence. The first is that the spheres were slowly rolled from softer material like clay. There's a lot of evidence that the spheres are tied to pottery styles from the pre-Columbian era, and they could have initially been rolled by hand and eventually pulled by teams and pulleys to keep them moving once they became too large to move individually. This is how many structures too big to be handled by bare hands, like the Moai of Easter Island and the monuments at Stonehenge, were constructed. The problem with this theory is that evidence is that the spheres are made from solid rock, not malleable material. But there's one more theory, and it's the one scientists everywhere are settling on. What if the only way to shape giant stones and turn them into these mysteriously smooth orbs was with other giant stones? A closer look at the stones indicates that while to the naked eye they looked pretty smooth, they're actually not perfect spheres. They're shaped slightly unevenly, and you can find traces of damage and markings from hammer stones. That indicates that the smaller stones were shaped by hand and formed into spheres from their original shape by standard pre-industrial tools like hammers and chisels. But what of the giant stones? They're still too large to be moved by craftsmen, but it's believed that they were finished by slowly working on chiseling them away with tools, then polishing them with sand. That's responsible for the smoother appearance, but they were likely carved from existing rocks with a natural shape. The biggest stones are probably in the same spot they were when they were originally carved, and those excavated indicate that they were moved enough to be polished all around. How were they moved? Likely in a similar way to the Easter Island statues, where they were hooked up to ropes and pulled by pulleys or walked by teams of workers. Your fellow archaeologists are impressed by your reasoned theory and they applaud. But there's still one big question hanging over everyone's head. These spheres are enormous, and with the technology of the time, people must have put a ridiculous amount of work into crafting them. But why? What was the significance of these stones that made them such an important project for the ancient pre-Columbian civilizations of Costa Rica that they crafted them over hundreds of years? The most common theory is religion, especially as the spheres were found near a graveyard. Could they be tributes to the deceased or offerings to the gods? We know relatively little about the religious beliefs of the people who crafted them, and there are no clear religious signifiers on the spheres. Another theory is that they could be artillery, as the carefully carved spheres resembled primitive cannonballs and could deliver some real destruction if aimed right. But while these theories make sense for the small to mid-sized ones, can you imagine trying to haul one of the giant ones to a catapult? And what kind of catapult could throw one anyway? The simplest solution may be that the spheres were decorative, an artistic flair created by an ancient civilization using only the basic tools. Why would a long-gone civilization want hundreds of carefully carved stone spheres scattered around their village? Who knows? But you could ask the same about your great-aunt and her collection of hundreds of cat statues. Your architectural expedition to explore the stone spheres of Costa Rica is at an end, and you've learned a lot. But for those who want to see these mysterious orbs for themselves, the National Monument of Guayalbo de Turrialba is open to the public. But the sites are closely guarded to make sure the stones don't get damaged. Several that were removed from the site for closer examination are on display in museums around the country, and the spheres are regarded as Costa Rica's most prized architectural possession. Some are even installed around the country in government buildings like the Legislative Assembly. There are still lots of questions about the mysterious stone spheres, and you and your friends will be far from the last with theories about how they were created. September 2022, after a 6-month military buildup, the People's Liberation Army launches an invasion of Taiwan. The United States, which has long warned that it would defend the fellow democracy, makes good on its promise and declares war on the People's Republic of China. As the United States and China become embroiled in a bitter South Pacific war, Russia seizes the opportunity to test NATO resolve and launches a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with troops also pressing into Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. NATO responds in force, led by U.S. European Command. World War III has officially begun, and it'll be the most destructive conflict ever waged by man. Luckily, though, you're prepared. China's 6-month-long buildup for an invasion of Taiwan has given the entire world enough time to prepare for the inevitable showdown between the U.S. and itself. And because you're a smart infographics viewer, you know that Russia could use the opportunity to attempt to restore its old Soviet glory by forcibly reuniting breakaway republics. So you've prepared for the nukes to start flying, and they almost certainly will, by pooling money together with several friends and family members to buy a boat and a whole lot of fuel. Because soon it's going to be up to you to restart civilization. The first nukes fall after the first 3 weeks. No one is sure who fired first. Given America's edge in conventional firepower, it's likely Russia or China launched first to attempt to neutralize the edge. At first, it's just a series of small, tactical weapons used against massed military forces and American carrier groups. The U.S. responds in kind. Soon, city busters are falling all around the globe, irradiating capitals that have stood for hundreds of years. You hear the final transmission from the President of the United States of America before the entire world goes silent for good. He's buried somewhere in a classified bunker, and he urges Americans and the rest of the world to remain strong. We can and will rebuild. Turns out, though, his location isn't nearly secret enough, and a Chinese deep-penetrating munition collapses his bunker. By now, the U.S. has already repaid the favor to Chinese and Russian leadership. Forget this "we" nonsense, because now it's up to you to rebuild civilization. Luckily, though, you're prepared and you've chosen just the place for it. You've had to carefully do your homework, though, because you need a place that isn't just remote, but has all the necessary survival features you need to make a new life. That means food, shelter, and water, but it also means a place that's distant enough from the irradiated wastelands of North America, Asia, and Europe to keep radioactive materials from suffocating you. That latter is probably your greatest concern. Hundreds of nuclear weapons have been dropped all over the world, putting as much radioactive dust and particles into the atmosphere as a massive supervolcano eruption. At this point, avoiding irradiation altogether is simply impossible. Anything living that needs to breathe is going to be ingesting some amount of radioactive material. However, by finding the right place to restart civilization, you can limit how exposed you become. To that end, you've settled on a small chain of islands known as Tristan da Cunha in the South Atlantic. Here, the trade winds blow almost straight east and do so with great zeal. This means radioactive dust is going to get pushed away from you as it drifts toward the southern hemisphere. Your only concern is radioactive debris from Australia, which, thanks to its cooperation with the United States, has taken several nuclear hits as well. However, major military targets in Australia are along the northern coast of the island continent, and there the trade winds pick up dust and debris and blow it in a northwest direction. It's not perfect, but on Tristan da Cunha, you're about as safe from radioactive debris clouds as you're gonna get. You're still gonna be sucking down irradiated dust, though. This is a simple fact of life, and you can expect your lifespan to be shortened by 2 or 3 decades. It's going to be a long time before anyone's celebrating a 100th birthday again. However, you can limit the damage by consuming charcoal, which will help absorb irradiated particles in your stomach and pass them through your system. The dust that settles in your lungs is the real problem, and wearing a mask will help, somewhat. The islands aren't uninhabited, and that's both a positive and negative. The positive is that the island chain's only permanent settlement, Edinburgh of the Seven Seas, is a small fishing and farming community. While they do import a lot of things, they're perfectly capable of sustaining themselves and have done so for 200 years. The negative is that because the island is inhabited, you're going to have to be dealing with other people who may not be so keen on sharing what they have, especially with the world having officially ended. Luckily, though, sea life is abundant on the island chain, so you better get used to sushi because you're going to be eating quite a lot of it. The influx of 24 more people may make some of the locals grumble and complain, but they're easily able to absorb the numbers given the island's abundance of fishing resources. Thankfully, the locals are actually very friendly and can't turn a boat full of people in need away. The additional mouths to feed can be offset by available fish and other seafood, and the volcanic soil of the island makes for great farming. While normally about half the island is a dedicated wildlife preserve, given the circumstances, those rules are lifted. Bad news for the many of the native bird species, but human life takes precedent. The normal rules allowing only 2 cows per household are lifted, though the limit can't be increased much more even with the addition of more grazing lands. so each household is now allowed a maximum of 3 cows. This will make meat rare, something you'll get to enjoy maybe once or twice a month. But you'll have plenty of farm-grown crops to enjoy and fish. Did we mention fish yet? What's even better is that the farming is done by hand or with the assistance of animals, and you realize there's actually very few gasoline-powered vehicles on the island. The lack of modern farming equipment is something the locals have had to make do with out of necessity before. Fuel would have to be imported all the way from the mainland Africa, making it extremely expensive. Now though, that lack of modern farming equipment is a lifesaver, as it means the locals have learned and preserved more ancient methods of farming that don't require a resource you'll never see again. This does unfortunately mean that the local power plant won't be putting out the electricity much longer, and you'll have to learn to make do. Despite being so close to the Antarctic, the weather rarely ever dips below 50 degrees, which is good news because there's very little plant life on the island and few trees. That means no firewood, which means no roaring fires to keep warm at. You'll just have to learn to bundle up when it gets cold. The place does get lashed by rain pretty frequently though, which is actually a good thing. While there's a freshwater source on the island, rains will give you a chance to replenish cisterns. You'll be taking in a few rads by drinking rainwater, but at this point everything you do is exposing you to radiation. You'll need to earn your keep, so as soon as you arrive, you and your group are put to work. There's plenty of crayfish fishing to do. In fact, before the world ended, it was the island's primary export. There's also farming to be done and animals to be tended to. Given the desperate state the world is in, the local government council opens up the other islands, natural preserves and UNESCO World Heritage Sites before the world ended, for exploitation. You and a group of men take a boat over and harvest some of the bird nests there to help supplement your diets. You're careful to leave enough untouched that the bird population will hardly notice the loss. There's enough birds to live in equilibrium as long as your island doesn't explode in population. The fact that there is a government is also a good thing, because order means stability. The local government is democratically elected and has an election every 3 years. The Island Council, as it's known, consists of 14 members, and they meet about 6 times a year. Back before Great Britain was bathed in nuclear hellfire, the town was English territory, with the Queen being radioactive dust now, though that matters little. Along with the Island Council is the Chief Islander, who's sorta like the island's president. He's too democratically elected every few years. The best part about the island, though, is its remoteness. It's over 1,700 miles from the nearest continent, Africa. That means any other desperate refugees are unlikely to make the journey or even know about the island in the first place. All that binging infographic show really paid off in the end. But there are problems with this little slice of would-be paradise. The first is the fact that the island is still an active volcano. The volcano rarely ever has a major eruption, the last one being in the early 1960s. But back then, the entire community had to be evacuated to mainland Britain by the government. When they returned, many of their homes had been destroyed. You will have to live under the shadow of imminent destruction for the rest of your unnaturally short life. And a large enough volcanic eruption could not only wipe out the small community, but bury the critical farming and grazing land under volcanic ash and lava flows. The death of the livestock would be a huge blow to your survival chances, but the loss of farming land might be the death knell for humanity. Luckily, this is unlikely to happen, but it's something you must worry about every day. The second problem is that medical resources are extremely limited. There is a single doctor on the island, but for anything requiring even moderate levels of care, including surgery, the locals have to ask for help from the mainland all the way in South Africa. This was always going to be a concern in an end-of-the-world scenario, but with no hospitals to raid for supplies, you can expect life expectancy to drop significantly for the survivors of the end of the world. The other major problem, however, is the fact that most of the island's residents are older, leaving few available women for repopulation. This is unsurprising, as most of the island's younger residents often choose to leave for Britain or South Africa, leaving behind an island of mostly pensioners. The island is believed to have been originally inhabited by 4 or 5 families, though, and most living residents can trace their lineage back to these original settlers. So as long as you brought a few women not related to you, you might have a chance of making a future for humanity that doesn't look like another Hills Have Eyes sequel. Those pensioners are going to die soon enough. In fact, they'll be dying much sooner than normal thanks to the sudden lack of mainland medical care, medicines, and the airborne radiation everyone's ingesting. That means you have limited time to learn the traditional survival techniques of the people. But there's an even bigger problem. You'll soon be left without most of your workforce. These numbers will have to be replenished, and soon, or the entire settlement simply collapses. For the women who have to come along, this means only one thing: babies. And you can't afford to be picky about your partner, because to ensure healthy genetic diversity, women are going to have to be making babies with most available men. The traditional values of monogamy and marriage are going to have to be temporarily suspended until humanity isn't living on the brink of extinction. All in all, though, you've really chosen the best place to try and bounce humanity back from nuclear extinction. While the temperature will drop a few degrees, you're glad to hear that old nuclear winter studies were overly pessimistic in their estimates. You should be able to survive long enough to pull humanity back from the edge. Of course, getting humanity back to the mainland is another problem altogether. The journey is 6 days by motorboat to South Africa, and gasoline will have run out long before your descendants are ready to leave the island. You can't store gasoline either, as it'll eventually go bad. However, humanity has made incredible voyages lasting weeks before in pretty rudimentary craft. That's how South Pacific Islanders came to inhabit such far-flung locations as Hawaii. So odds are good that thanks to your solid judgment and watching infographics show, humanity will rebuild. Probably only to destroy itself once more in nuclear hellfire, but hey, you did your job. According to Greek mythology, an immortal being named Prometheus stole fire from the gods and bestowed it upon humanity, the first of many gifts to enable the beginning of civilization. Early Chinese histories tell of a succession of 8 semi-divine leaders who in turn taught hunting, farming, music, working with silk, and all of the practical arts. In similar fashion, Sumerian god Enki shared the wisdom needed for governing the earliest cities with a group of 7 sages. Stories of heroes like these are common around the world. When ancient storytellers looked back, trying to imagine the beginnings of technology, communication systems, and religious customs, the complexities seemed best explained as gifts from a divine intelligence, and they had good reason to wonder about their own origins. Writing, as far as we know, arose as a product of civilization. The earliest phases of the first civilization left no written records, so where did civilization really come from? Once writing arises in a civilization, it may offer a big spike in the amount of data available to scientists, but not necessarily. The writing systems of the Indus Valley Civilization and the Minoan Civilization of Crete are just 2 examples that are still a mystery. Unless we manage to make sense of these symbols, much of their culture and history will remain opaque. The decipherment of the Egyptian hieroglyphics, Mayan glyphs, and the cuneiform writing of the Mesopotamian empires each opened up entire worlds of literature, chronicles of dynasties, and a high level of scientific knowledge among these ancient peoples. But the earliest phases of each civilizations don't have writing. In a way, when it comes to eras with no written history, we have a similar problem to the authors of the ancient myths. But rather than appeal to divine intervention, modern researchers can literally dig for the evidence, building upon a century of increasingly sophisticated archaeological methods. One of the central questions in piecing together the history of civilization is the extent to which ideas and technologies spread from one region to another. In the most extreme view, called hyperdiffusionism, civilization started once in a single location and then gradually spread everywhere else. Social scientists have long abandoned the single origin model, instead seeing various societies developing in parallel. On the other hand, there's a great deal of evidence for trade, war, and other forms of contact between many cities of the ancient world within their respective regions, over considerable distances for pack animals or early navigators. Jewelry from the valley of the Indus River in South Asia turns up in Mesopotamia. The striking blue stone lapis lazuli makes its way from Afghanistan to Egypt. Some of the most significant diffusion came in the spread of domesticated crops and animals. Wheat, for instance, started out as a wild grass in the Middle East. More than 10,000 years ago, people were already planting it as a staple crop in that region, beginning the process of breeding varieties better suited for consumption and harvest than their wild cousins. Over time, these crops and the knowledge to grow and process them spread outward, reaching southeastern Europe by as early as 9,000 years ago, and other parts of Europe over the course of the following 3,000 years. Similarly, corn, or maize, starts out as a much scrawnier wild grain called teosinte in southern Mexico. As early as 10,000 years ago, ancient farmers there began breeding maize into varieties resembling the modern crop. From there, corn made its way northward via trade network or other interregional contact to the desert of the Southwest, the Mississippi, and beyond. Other innovations spread through a literal arms race. The phase Bronze Age refers to different actual periods of time in different locations. Archaeologists use the term to describe a span of time beginning when the bronze tools show up in a region and lasting until iron implements made their local debut. The manufacturing of bronze can only happen if you have a supply of copper, tin, and sometimes other metals, one or more of which may require long-distance trade. And of course, you have to understand the process of casting bronze once you have the materials. But if you know that neighboring states are arming themselves with bronze weapons, you have a strong incentive to figure out a way to make that happen. Its utility in both weapons and tools encouraged the spread of bronze technology throughout West Asia, Northern Africa, and the Mediterranean. Bronze also spread within East Asia, starting in China, where its manufacture seems to have arisen independently. A similar process of military competition spread the use of horses and war chariots. In archaeological terms, before the Bronze Age came the Neolithic, and in some ways this is where the greatest mystery lies. Whereas the transition from stone tools to metal is partial, gradual, and not even essential, the Maya and the Aztec did just fine with razor-sharp obsidian, the Neolithic represented a basic break from what had been the normal social model that was in place, even before the arrival of modern Homo sapiens. The beginning of the Neolithic or New Stone Age is sometimes called a revolution. In a Paleolithic or Old Stone Age society, the group size is limited to a few dozen individuals. Life revolves around the procurement of food from the land, gathering wild plants, catching fish, and hunting game. This is not always a bad thing. In a region and time when resources are plentiful, the effort needed for subsistence can be low, allowing people to live a varied, fulfilling, and meaningful life. But there's not always a safety net if circumstances take a bad turn. Storing a surplus is a challenge if you are frequently on the move. If for some reason the supply of game dwindles, you may have a hard time. Lots of large mammal species died off at the end of the last ice age. Evidence suggests that Homo sapiens may have been a little too skillful at hunting for their own good, leaving populations too small to recover in one region after another. Whatever the reason, the strategies for survival among many groups of people had to change in the millennia between 2,000 and 10,000 years ago. After the last ice age, for the first time, people began putting down roots in a literal sense. Agriculture seems to have been one of the most important adaptations to the new environmental challenges. The early agrarian societies could stockpile some surplus. The extra food allowed some members of a community to invest labor in specialized activities, such as pottery and tool manufacture, which in turn could help grow and store crops. Populations rose along with increased harvests. Another innovation, organized violence. One community might raise a neighbor's stockpiles or fight over the control of limited resources. Defense became important. Conflict may have helped bring on another side effect of sedentary life, the development of social hierarchies. Some individuals became leaders in combat, but also ultimately for projects such as the digging of irrigation canals for crops and building of public structures like religious sites and fortifications. Leadership seems to have fostered privilege, either through voluntary acknowledgement or as coerced tribute. High status might then pass from one generation to the next. But even if you could defend your supplies, a prolonged drought or deluge had the prospect of slow starvation. And so two tasks became paramount: an understanding of the seasons and making sure the gods of the harvest were pleased or at least appeased. Both religious rituals and cycles of planting and harvest involved reading the signs in the sky. Exactly how the heavens ruled the earth was a matter for the storytellers, but it was a demonstrable fact that nature of the seasons held sway over life and death. The procession of the constellations, the phases of the moon, the lengths of the days, and the direction of the sun all somehow related to the yearly changes in rainfall and the growth of plants. In the isolated villages of hunter-gatherers, shamans could intercede between the world of human beings and the spirits, answering questions as they arose. But as towns grew, they required a more institutionalized approach to maintaining the cosmic order, and with it, the rainfall, the harvests, and even the daily procession of the sun. The gods needed priests, and often they needed blood. In places where farming developed, a culture of sacrifice seems to have followed. Some of the grain, some of the alcohol, the fruits of the field were reserved for the gods, returned in thanksgiving to ensure that the earth would continue to provide. And where animals were raised, their slaughter was in some measure dedicated to the patron deities of the tribe. Of course, giving the best part of a precious resource back to the gods could be counterproductive. Hence, another myth of Prometheus. He once tricked Zeus into accepting a sacrifice of bones and fat, reserving the meat for human beings, and setting a precedent that the Greeks could follow thereafter. Zeus wasn't amused, and the gods could demand much more. If they needed human blood, they would get it. And so a pattern followed. Populations grew as food security increased. Settlements exceeded 10,000 people, first in Western Asia and soon in Egypt, South Asia, and China, eventually in Europe, Southeast Asia, Mesoamerica, and South America, and finally in North America. And in general, once a critical mass arrived, a professional priesthood emerged, often with the grim business of human sacrifice. Still, if civilization became a stage for the conflicts between human and cosmic, life and death, it also became a platform for the ever-expanding repertoire of innovations. As they studied the skies, the Sumerians and Babylonians not only intuited the will of the heavens, but also established the beginnings of science. The same characters that the kings of China's Shang state had etched into the bones for divination allowed for the compositions of the philosophies of Confucius and Lao Tzu. Baking bread naturally led to baking exquisite clay pottery, and the same melted alloy of ores could allow one to cast a sword or a sublime work of classical sculpture. So, what led to civilization? Necessity, coercion, community, inertia, fear, pragmatism, and imagination. In short, humanity. Phew, that was a complicated one. Non-state or stateless societies were the norm in the past, and then with the rise of agricultural practices, we got together and formed societies and started to cooperate in larger groups than our tribe, and so begun our civilization process, but also with it, despotic leaders, human rights abuses, and sometimes brutal laws. Homo sapiens, once mostly nomadic hunter-gatherers, banded together and created towns and cities, and sometimes ineluctable hierarchies. This Neolithic revolution made us more sedentary, perhaps less prone to violence. That's a hot potato of a question. And it had a huge impact on our health. But how do we in our cities compare to wild people still living in tribes? Today we'll explore this comparison in this episode of the Infographic Show. Why is this tribe so far from civilization so healthy? First of all, we're going to focus on one tribe as that's where a lot of recent research has been done. We are by no means saying that being tribal means having great health, or that this one group of people and their health mirrors tribal societies in, say, the Arctic, Amazon rainforest, or the Sahara Desert. The Bushmen of southern Africa lead a very different lifestyle from the most remote hill tribes of northern Thailand. Interestingly though, you can find reports of Kalahari Bushmen saying when modern life encroached into their lifestyle, the price to pay was high. Disease, booze, and too many babies to young mothers, writes the BBC. The hill tribes of Thailand have also been tested by modern consumerism, rife alcoholism, and methamphetamine abuse. But let's put that aside for now and go across the world to Bolivia. A BBC article in 2017 said the healthiest hearts in the world have been found in the Chimene people in the forests of Bolivia. So who are the Chimene people? The BBC says they number around 16,000, but other reports say the population is much smaller than that, around 2,000 to 6,000. They can be found in lowland Bolivia and live for the most part by subsistence farming. This basically means self-sufficiency farming in which you produce enough for you and your family or group to eat and don't create enough for trade. The Chimene also hunt and go fishing for their meals. In recent years, some of the Chimene have been farming and selling what they grew and also using cash. They speak Chimene, which is what we call a language isolate. That means it doesn't come from other languages. But what's interesting to us is their good health. Let's have a look at that. If we look at Western countries, we can see that heart disease is often the #1 killer. In the USA, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention puts it at the top just above cancer. The third spot and way behind was accidents. We don't need to tell you that heart disease, despite sometimes just running in the family, can often be prevented or stalled by having a healthier diet, doing a bit of exercise, and perhaps going easy on the cigarettes and the 14-hour shifts with 30-minute lunch breaks at McDonald's. Scientists wanted to find out just how much we might prevent this killer disease by changing our lifestyle. To do this, they did the right thing and looked at heart disease rates in the USA, looked at the lifestyle of many people in the country, and then compared it to heart disease and lifestyle in the Chimene groups. The introduction in the paper published by The Lancet said, to better understand the association between the pre-industrial lifestyle and low prevalence of coronary artery disease risk factors, we examined the Chimene, a Bolivian population living a subsistence lifestyle of hunting, gathering, fishing, and farming, with few cardiovascular risk factors, but high infectious inflammatory burden. What did the researchers find out? Well, after they took a number of flights and even traveled by canoe to get to the Amazon, they found that the Chimene lifestyle was indeed very different from your average American, Brit, Frenchman, or Canadian. They found that 17% of the Chimene diet was wild game. This is a lot of meat that mostly consisted of wild pig, tapir, which looks like a cross between a pig and a baby elephant, and capybara, kind of like a giant guinea pig. They were also partial to fish. About 7% of their diet that came in the form of catfish and piranha. To fill up, they ate rice, maize, and something similar to sweet potato. And they also liked plantains, not so different from bananas. They also foraged and ate nuts and lots of fruit. The scientists said that, all in all, about 72% of their calories came from carbohydrates, which is more than in the US, at about 52%. Fats made up 14% of their diet compared to 34% in the US. The scientists added that people in the US ate way more saturated fat. They weren't much different from people in the US in one respect, and that was that both got about 14% of their calories from protein. Although the researchers said the Chimene ate more lean meat. What about burning those calories? Well, this is where folks in the US were very different. Have you been counting your steps using an app? If so, even if you move a lot in the day, 10,000 steps isn't bad at all. But the Chimene were averaging 17,000 for men and 16,000 for women every day. Even the people aged over 60 were getting in an average of 15,000 steps a day. How does this all affect their health? The scientists looked at something called coronary artery calcium. If you have a lot of it, you are on your way to heart problems. You have clogged up arteries. At the age of 45, the Chimene had pretty much no CAC at all. Americans, on the other hand, at that age do. About 25% of people in total. When Americans reach 75, 80% of them will have CAC. Only 1/3 of the Chimene will. Nowhere on Earth have researchers found people with such good tickers. A professor of anthropology at the University of California said that Japanese women were good, but this is a whole new ballpark. The conclusion is that your average Chimene person has the vascular health of an American 50-year-old when they're 80. We should add that the Chimene run the risk of easily contracting infectious diseases and don't have the healthcare most Westerners do. It's not some kind of health utopia in the Chimene, but we can learn a lot from them. Nonetheless, it was revealed 2/3 of them suffer intestinal worms, and they have a very hard life without fresh water, sewerage, or electricity, according to one researcher. They have good hearts, but it doesn't mean they don't face other problems. How do we get the hearts of the Chimene? It's quite simple. Don't stuff yourself with saturated fats and sugars. Keep your blood sugar, your LDL cholesterol, and your blood pressure low. Maybe even more importantly, try to move around a bit and not just during the weekend. Studies show that industrialized nations, the average person might sit for 54% of the day. The Chimene spent about 10% of the day sedentary. But lo and behold, something similar is happening to the Chimene that has been happening to other tribal people we talked about at the start of the show. Modernity is encroaching into their lifestyle, and they have started buying sugary goods and cooking oils at markets. We're told their cholesterol levels are getting worse. However, Professor Naveed Sattar from the University of Glasgow called the study beautiful. He told the BBC, simply put, eating a healthy diet very low in saturated fat and full of unprocessed products, not smoking, and being active lifelong is associated with the lowest risk of having furring up of the blood vessels. Researchers said while our jobs make it hard for us to move about a lot, that's what we should try to do, whether walking to work or cycling to work. It's not always easy in the depth of winter during a bitterly cold, unforgiving December. Well, try to stand more at work, say the researchers. Another doctor said this about the Chimene. They also live in small communities. Life is very social and they maintain a positive outlook. This could be more important than you think. You might remember reports about the inhabitants of Roseto, Pennsylvania. Researchers who went there in the 1960s found that the people didn't exactly have the greatest diet. They also smoked. They drank a lot, and yet they were much healthier on average than their compatriots. Scientists, as is written in the Book of Sapiens, were stumped. People of the town, just about all of Italian descent, smoked really strong cigars, drank with abandon, and ate what they wanted, and yet they outlived other Americans on average. Heart disease rates were much lower than neighboring towns. Much of the men also worked hard in nearby slate quarries, and when they got home, it's said they ate a fatty diet full of cholesterol. Lots of cheese, lots of salami, lots of fried sausages. The Huffington Post wrote in 2008, wine was consumed in preference to all American soft drinks and even milk. Is becoming a wino, a sausage addict, and a chain smoker the answer to all of our health issues? Is a bottle of Bordeaux and a stodgy cigar the panacea for that premature knock on the door by the Grim Reaper? Not quite so, unfortunately. This is what the researchers concluded when trying to figure out why these folks lived longer and suffered less heart disease than fellow Americans. They were happier. The Rosetans lived in in a very tightly knit community. They were never alone. They ate together, they drank wine together, they looked after each other. No one seemed too unhappy or too stressed out, wrote the Huffington Post. And the proof was a heart attack death rate almost half of everyone else around them. 3 families might live in one house. The old folks were not sent away to drizzle out their last years within the confines of some deathly care home. Like the Chimene, they were very social and took care of their community. Unfortunately, as time went by, this all changed, and the people of Roseto started to live like their neighbors. The American Journal of Public Health investigated the town in 1992, more than 30 years after the initial reports, and researchers said the average Rosetan had become Americanized. The sense of community was gone, and so was the good health. They were stressed, they were sometimes lonely, and the Roseto effect was no longer in effect. Perhaps if we deal with our stress and maintain our close relationships, if we have fun as often as we can, and nurture love around us, it can impact our health in a positive way, as it did according to those scientists for the Rosetans. Maybe we can take a leaf out of the Chimene Book of Life and move around a lot more, eating largely non-processed foods. Maybe then we'll live healthier and longer lives. Ancient Egypt, one of the great empires in human history, the creators of the Great Pyramid and the mighty Sphinx. At one time, they were the most powerful country on Earth. But today, if you seek the empire, all you'll find is ruins. What happened to the empire of ancient Egypt? Did they fall prey to conquest, to civil war? Were they undone by climate or plague? Or was the answer something more complicated? To find the end, we have to go back to the beginning. How did Egypt become a powerhouse in the first place? It turns out the answer is climate change. Today, you'll find a desert surrounding Cairo. But in the days when the kingdom of ancient Egypt first began forming, it was a much different place. The area was less dry, covered in trees and grass, and had a lush ecosystem filled with large animals and flocks of birds. That led to the area that's now Egypt becoming a haven for wandering tribes. And around 7,500 years ago, it had become a thriving home of multiple cultures. They were domesticating animals, developing tools and pottery, and starting rudimentary systems of government. And if there's one rule in this world, it's that it's good to be the first. The early years of the region were dominated by the Badarian people, who were the first tribe known to have settled there. They were soon followed by the Nakada, which forged weapons from imported obsidian and built the region from a few small farms into a large city. And it was about location, location, location. The Nakada were now in control of the Nile Valley, and most of the trade in the region went through them. They quickly established relations with both Nubia and Mesopotamia, traded their crafts all around the region, and even developed the first rudimentary system of written symbols that would eventually evolve into hieroglyphics. And this civilization was about to take its first big leap into empire. But first, are you ready to take your own big leap into forming an empire? Because you can with the sponsor of today's video, Rise of Kingdoms, the free cross-platform strategy game with over 100 million players worldwide. In Rise of Kingdoms, you get to choose a real civilization from history, recruit hundreds of real-life historical generals, train special soldiers from each civilization, collect resources, and develop technology as you break through to the next era of history and build your ultimate dream city. There's never been a better time to try the Rise of Kingdoms, since now you can play as the mysterious, majestic kingdom of Egypt. Build pyramids, grotto tombs, sun temples, and even Greco-Roman styles in the original Egyptian architectural style. Bring powerful troops and historical heroes to the battlefield, like the great war hero Thutmose III, the great priest Imhotep, Ramses II, and even Cleopatra, as you compete with 12 other civilizations to make sure that this time, the once great civilization doesn't disappear from the map. So what are you waiting for? And there's never been a better time to try Rise of Kingdoms, since it's now available both on mobile and PC. Click the link in the description to download the game now, and use the gift code to get bonus resources. By participating in in-game community events, new and current players will have the chance to win a round-trip ticket to Egypt. But back to the real Egypt. How does a dynasty begin? With a king, of course. Much of early Egyptian history is vague, since few people were writing it down. But the famous Egyptian priest and scholar Manetho claimed that the official history began with a king named Menes. At the time, Egypt was split into 2 kingdoms, and the king slowly unified them into one. However, many historians believe that Menes might be an amalgamation of different kings or a myth designed to create a unifying figure. The transition to a unified Egypt may have happened more slowly, but what is known is that around 3150 BCE, the early dynastic period was beginning, and it would soon grow beyond their wildest dreams. The early kings were based in Lower Egypt, with the capital in Memphis. A combination of labor and a rich agricultural sector allowed the kings to grow their wealth rapidly, and they spent it on one thing that made sense, of course: massive tombs celebrating the man who made it all possible. Every successive king built elaborate structures for themselves, and this was the era where the king started to be worshipped as a god. While these mastaba tombs weren't the same as the eventual pyramids, it's easy to see the influence on what would become Egypt's greatest architectural achievement. And after only 500 years, Egypt and the world looked completely different. The age of the Old Kingdom is believed to have begun around 2686 BCE, and this is where the ancient Egypt that most people know took shape. The kingdom was booming, as their vast agricultural sector could sustain a larger population, and new arrivals were coming from all around Africa and Asia. A strong system of government was forming, with administrators collecting taxes and using the money to create infrastructure, including irrigation systems that made the crops bear more vegetables. If you were the ruling class at this point, life was good. Although if you were a peasant, maybe less so. It was common for the working class to be drafted by the rulers to work on whatever construction project was deemed most important at the moment. And this was where the king's power reached their apex. It's called spectacle creep, and we see it in the movies. The last installment in the series had the heroes fight a T-Rex. Well, in this installment, they have to fight 3 cyborg T-Rexes. There were no cyborg T-Rexes in Egypt, but every king felt the pressure to top his successor. Both meant continuing the path of endless growth for the empire and creating even more impressive monuments. This period was where Egypt created the monuments that still stand today: the Great Pyramid of Giza and the Sphinx, both of which tower over the modern cities today and bring people from around the world. But the first crack in the armor of ancient Egypt was about to emerge. The kings were devoting a lot of resources to celebrating themselves, but the kingdom's vast resources made sure no one noticed, until the resources weren't there. The extensive land grants to temples celebrating past kings were starting to take their toll on the kingdom's economy. The king started to face opposition from local governors, and the country became decentralized. But as long as the economy remained stable, the king could hold on to power. But the good times couldn't last forever. Around 2200 BCE, the kingdom was hit with severe droughts, devastating the agricultural sector and taking the country with it. The central government collapsed, and those seeking power celebrated. But their celebration was not going to last. The first intermediate period of ancient Egypt lasted around 125 years, but it would feel a lot longer. While many ambitious governors hoped an Egypt without a central government would lead to opportunities for them, they were soon hit hard with the truth. With no central government, there was no one to give them money to maintain their areas. This led to massive food shortages, which led to a civil war. Those local leaders who had no plan often saw their rules end quickly and brutally, but those who knew how to adapt saw their provinces flourish and the local economy excel. And with no king, those local governors often saw themselves become kings of their own little world and spread out seeking more. So what would a divided Egypt look like? During this century-long period, Egypt was dominated by 2 kingdoms: the Kingdom of Thebes in the south and the Kingdom of Heracleopolis to the north. But as time went on, the forces in Thebes, led by the Intef family, grew stronger, and in 2055, King Mentuhotep II led the Theban forces deep into Heracleopolitan territory and accomplished what had only happened once before: the unification of Egypt. A new era was about to begin, the Middle Kingdom. But fractures in Egypt's structure had been revealed, and the question was whether the new rulers would learn from the past. Magic 8 Ball says, outlook cloudy. At first, it seemed like the good times were here again. The new rulers of Egypt, starting with Mentuhotep II, went back to expanding the kingdom and created a boom in art, literature, and building of monuments. To the outsider, Egypt looked like it was stronger than ever before, and in many ways it was. The new dynasty wanted Egypt to be less vulnerable to natural disaster than before, and in addition to expanding the country's agricultural efforts, they conquered areas of the Kingdom of Nubia and took over the quarries and gold mines. They were also clearly worried about being vulnerable to conquest, so they developed one of the first large-scale security projects in the history of the world, a massive fortification known as the Walls of the Ruler that guarded the eastern front of Egypt. It would lead to some significant shifts in the culture as well. While early Egyptian art was more focused on celebrating the ruler, now things were developing a little subtlety. Much of the art and literature during the era had an introspective edge, and the gods the Egyptians worshipped were given more complexity. Osiris became the most significant deity during this era, and this god of fertility had many statues and monuments made of him. Construction projects were ramping up, and Egypt had much need for labor, so they brought in many foreign workers to toil on these projects and ramped up building and mining. This would prove to be the Middle Kingdom's undoing. The second golden era for Egypt was undone by drought and famine. This time the enemy would be too much of a good thing. Massive Nile floods hit the region, causing extensive damage to the under-construction infrastructure and straining the economy. The ruler at the time, Amenemhat III, was unprepared, and the large number of Canaanite settlers he allowed in as workers suddenly posed a threat as people scrambled to survive. This group, known as the Hyksos, soon took power in the Nile Delta, and the process of carving up of Egypt soon would begin. The ancient Egyptians had built a stunning achievement, but it would never get this good again. I know what you're thinking, but there's so much of Egyptian history to come. What about all those famous rulers of Egypt who haven't even reigned yet? Here's the big twist. They ruled all right, but that doesn't mean that they were Egyptians. Because from here on out, the empire of ancient Egypt becomes less of a stable country and more of the world's biggest game of keep-away. They built something amazing, but the question now becomes if they're strong enough to keep it, and who will reap the benefits when the original rulers fall. And the first rulers were already there. The Hyksos, who were one of the largest group of foreigners in Egypt, quickly took advantage of the chaos and established their own power base in the delta. They spread out from there, and it was around 1785 BCE when they made their move on the current capital of Egypt in Avaris. The king, who had lost much of his power base, was forced to flee back to Thebes. Maybe it was the way the Hyksos were invited in, but they didn't seem interested in deposing the rulers, instead treating the king as a subordinate. As long as he paid them tribute, he was free to continue to rule, but anyone who visited Egypt at the time might have been fooled into thinking the Egyptians were still in charge, because the Hyksos seemed to like patterning their society after them. While they kept many of the cultural trappings of the era, they did make big leaps in one area, and that all comes back to war. The Egyptians had a powerful army, but it was high on manpower and low on modern weaponry. The Hyksos quickly changed that, bringing in new tools like the composite bow for fast firing and horse-drawn chariots for fast riding. Soon, enemies would be facing much more dangerous Egyptian army, and just in time, because they were ready to make a move. The central government in Thebes had been quietly building its strength and was ready to try and take control of its territory again. A brutal civil war lasted 30 years. At the same time, the Nubian Empire to the south was ready to make a move into Egypt and take over Thebes. Ultimately, the war ended in a stalemate as Thebes fended off Nubia but failed to defeat the Hyksos, and the once mighty empire now stood divided for another generation. But everything old is new again. The Theban forces had a new king, Ahmose I, and he made the rebuilding of Egypt's military a big priority. Through a hard-fought campaign, he drove the Hyksos out of Egypt and reclaimed the lost territory. But he wasn't done yet. He wanted to take control of the Near East and take as much of the territory that surrounded Egypt. So began the age of the New Kingdom, which would last around 500 years and be ancient Egypt's last hurrah. This new Egypt not only built itself the largest empire the country had ever seen, but its kings took on a new title, Pharaoh. This was also the era of one of Egypt's most famous rulers, the Queen Hatshepsut, who ruled as a pharaoh and repaired much of the damage done by the Hyksos. She led many of the trading expeditions, leading to Egypt gaining large quantities of imports, such as bronze and wood. With these new resources, massive temples would be built, and she would go down as one of Egypt's greatest rulers. With new territory and more resources, it seemed like the new kingdom might go down as the beginning of something enduring for Egypt. But all it takes is one bad apple to screw up the whole barrel. Why did the New Kingdom eventually decline? It's a complicated issue, but the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten certainly didn't help. A notoriously eccentric and ruthless ruler, he abandoned Egypt's traditional polytheistic faith and instead announced the obscure sun god Aten would instead be worshipped as the one true god. Followers of the other gods were persecuted, massive projects dedicated to extolling Aten were started, and he even ordered the capital city moved to a new location, one which he named after himself, of course. His legacy only lasted as long as his life, and his successor, the famous boy king Tutankhamun, quickly started undoing many of his edicts and restored the traditional system of worship. Could a country recover from the reign of a mad king? It could when they had a great one right around the corner. Around 1279 BCE, Ramses II took the throne, believed by many to be the pharaoh of the biblical Exodus. What is known is that this ambitious ruler was responsible for a massive increase in statues and obelisks, as he put the country's massive resources to work. He also began conquests in the neighboring areas, waging an extensive battle against the Hittites that led to the first peace treaty in recorded history. To anyone living under Egypt under Ramses II, life was good. No wonder they built so many statues of this guy. But Egypt may have ultimately been a victim of its success. Egypt was now the richest country in the world, and it was surrounded by people who wanted a piece of that. The Libyan Berbers to the west were watching enviously from their much poorer country. In Egypt's territory in Canaan, they were dealing with the growing Assyrian Empire on their borders. In the Aegean Sea, a loose group of seafaring pirates began waging attacks on the border. The Egyptian army was strong enough to fend these invaders off at first, but another danger was brewing. Within the vast infrastructure Ramses II had created, the high priests had much power, and they often used this to enrich themselves, essentially becoming local governors. This was what accelerated the collapse of the country during the previous era, and history was repeating itself. But this time the consequences would be more dire. Two empires on their borders and a marauding band of pirates in their territorial waters meant the Egyptians would be fighting a war on multiple fronts indefinitely, and it took its toll. Egypt lost much of its territory in the Near East, and around 1069 the Third Intermediate Period began. This was when Egypt's empire largely started falling apart, without and within. The high priests of Thebes took more autonomy over their city, Libyan forces took control of the south of the country, and power struggles continued to undermine the country. 300 years into this period, an invasion from Kushite territory seized Thebes and the Delta, and King Piye began to establish his own empire. Egypt would remain, but would it really be Egypt anymore? You might be surprised. The Kushite rule of Egypt took on many of the attributes of the original rulers, and many of the defining traits of the empire are actually from this period, namely the pyramids. While the Great Pyramid was built thousands of years earlier, the Kushites were the one who built the majority of Egypt's pyramids. But despite this, Egypt's influence in the world was waning greatly. Most of the territories had been claimed by other empires, and their allies were quickly becoming conquered by the Assyrians. And it wouldn't be long before the Assyrians set their eyes on Egypt, invading in the early 600s BCE and driving out the Kushites. But this wouldn't be like other conquests. The Assyrians had their own culture and no interest in adopting the Egyptian one. They promptly sacked the famous temples of Thebes, took control of the kingdom and turned it over to their vassals rather than administer it directly. This left them open to betrayal, and only a few decades later the regional king cut a deal with Greek mercenaries and drove the Egyptians out of Egypt. The Greeks gained influence in Egypt, celebrated their victory, and then were promptly invaded by the powerful Persian Empire in 525. While the Persian ruler called himself Pharaoh of Egypt, he didn't even base his rule there, instead administering it from Iran and putting down rebellions. This was the official end of the Egyptian Empire, and it was annexed by the Persians. But it was far from the end of Egypt. Egypt was still a wealthy region with no shortage of treasures, and just about every empire in the world wanted a piece of it. The reign of the Persians lasted several hundred years, but in 332 BCE, a new top dog in the world had emerged. He ruled the Ptolemaic kingdom, and he had come to be known as Alexander the Great. At the time, Egypt was ruled by Persian agents, and the public resented their treatment. So when Alexander and his army came rolling in, they were greeted as deliverers. Unlike the Assyrians and the Persians, Alexander the Great had a deep admiration for the culture of ancient Egypt and restored many of its cultural elements. Basing his capital in the port city of Alexandria, he turned it into a thriving city of trade and learning, and his successors built the famous Lighthouse of Alexandria, making Egypt the only country to have two of the seven wonders of the world. It was Egypt's greatest era as a colony, with Hellenistic culture and Egyptian culture living side by side. But all good things must come to an end. Alexander the Great was a one-of-a-kind leader, and his successors struggled to maintain peace and keep the public happy. This led to an internal strife, attempts by ambitious rulers to reform the Egyptian religion, and localized rebellions. But one area was booming: trade. In fact, Egyptians were sending more of their grain abroad than ever before now that they had a powerful neighbor, the Roman Empire, the fast-growing continent-spanning kingdom based out of Italy. Rome was increasingly dependent on Egyptian exports, and some scheming rulers started thinking, wouldn't it just be easier if we owned Egypt instead of buying things from them? But wait, what happened to the most famous Egyptian ruler of all? If you ask people for one Egyptian ruler, odds are they'll name Cleopatra, the powerful queen best known for starring in her own Shakespeare play and being famously played by Elizabeth Taylor and soon Gal Gadot. But what most people don't know is that she wasn't Egyptian at all. She was the last queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty and famously fell in love with Roman politician Mark Antony. They attempted to defend Egypt against the Roman invasion, but their forces were defeated, and Octavian, the man who would become the first Roman emperor, took control of the massive territory. And with that, most people believed that the newly named Emperor Augustus became the richest man in the world. Obtaining what was once the richest country in the world would do that. And so the Egyptian empire ended not with a bang, but a whimper. The Romans ruled the Egyptians with a firmer hand than any other empire, administering it directly and eliminating many of their traditions. As Christianity took root in Rome, it would soon establish itself in Egypt as well, with the Egyptian Orthodox Church becoming one of the earliest denominations of Christianity to still be around. The Romans were the strongest empire in the world at the time, some would argue ever, and no other power challenged their reign. resistance against Roman rule was limited within Egypt as they were too busy fighting amongst themselves. The battle between Christianity and the local faith continued for several hundred years until 391 CE, when Emperor Theodosius declared Christianity the official religion of Egypt and shuttered the temples. Slowly, the traditions of ancient Egypt faded into history, and hieroglyphics became a lost language for a long time. But no empire lasts forever. The Roman Empire slipped into decline by the 4th century CE, and Egypt found itself as part of the Eastern Empire based in Constantinople. As empires battled for the scraps left by Rome, Egypt would find itself under Persian control once again, and the Byzantine Empire would retake it in the 600s. Finally, in 639, the Muslim Rashidun army would invade and throw out the Byzantine army, establishing the Muslim Arab rule of the country that largely continues to this day. Egypt endures, and so do many of its greatest cultural artifacts, but the Egypt that exists today is only roughly 20 empires removed from the one that defined it. Which raises the question, why did Egypt ultimately fall? It's hard to pinpoint one point of failure, especially since Egypt is one of the first empires to grace the earth. But ancient Egypt did not die out due to the climate or internal strife or rival nations, it died out due to all of them. The kingdom didn't fall once, it fell again and again and again, sometimes to invasion, sometimes to other factors. But its internal structure was strong enough that when the opportunity presented itself, it would rebuild fairly quickly and take back control. Its two later Great Kingdom periods both came after intermediate periods of collapse, and it came back from each period stronger. So why didn't that repeat itself another time? The most likely explanation is that after the third intermediate period, what was left just wasn't strong enough to maintain any consistent resistance. The constant ebb and flow of various empires and their differing approaches to governing the Egyptian people likely kept any powerful rebellion from emerging. And by the time Rome came into the picture, it had been hundreds of years since Egypt had been an independent nation. Then came the long period of Roman oppression, where most of what Egypt stood for was systematically wiped out. By the time that it ended, the remnants of ancient Egypt were nothing but ruins, and the sense of a national identity was weaker than ever. So, what about Egypt today? Egypt was a province of the British Empire until 1922. It had previously been ruled by the Ottomans, but has maintained independence for 100 years now. Still, largely populated by Arab Muslim populations that took over in a previous conquest in the post-Rome era, their 100 years of liberation has been chaotic. They've been involved in several wars and have been ruled by kings, socialist leaders, elected leaders, and currently a military dictator. But despite this, they're considered one of the most stable countries in the Middle East and have a strong diplomatic relationship with most of their neighbors. As for their history, they still hold their time as top empire of Africa with great pride, and many of the remaining sites are among the world's greatest tourist sites. But ancient Egypt's greatest legacy might be outside of the country. There are a few ancient empires that capture the world's fascination more than Egypt, with trappings like the pyramids, the Sphinx, the story of Exodus, and of course the mummies who are probably not getting back out of their sarcophaguses once they were entombed in real life. No empire lasts forever. If the ancient Egyptians are still featuring in Hollywood movies thousands of years later, it's pretty safe to say the Romans weren't as successful as they'd hoped. Much has been said about great monuments around the world that are so magnificent in their structures that it boggles the mind how the ancients built them. According to some left-field theorists, people didn't build them at all, but aliens descended from the skies in what some have called giant eggs or boats, and it was those beings that actually built the structures. Well, if not built them, then directed the construction. That's how a pyramid could be made sitting at true north, say the theorists. They go one step further too, telling us that the pharaohs were actually alien-human hybrids. Sounds pretty far-fetched, but what's leading some to make these claims? Is there any evidence at all? Let's take a look at why some people believe this. As you may have seen in our other shows on the pyramids, to some Egyptologists, the question of how the pyramids were built still remains shrouded in mystery. We're not only talking about the hard labor of moving millions of stones, dragging them across the land, and then up the foundation, but the absolute precision in regards to just how they lie. The fact that the pyramids of Giza sit true north should be astounding to just about anyone, not just conspiracy theorists, while others who have studied the structure insist that this great monument was precisely built to reflect the dimensions of our planet. There are critics of this theory, and they state that if you shuffle the numbers enough, you can get the results you want to fit your theory. Nonetheless, with the pyramids being so incredibly majestic, it's certainly understandable that some people think that humans had a helping hand from something not of this world. Slightly more down-to-earth but still outside of the mainstream theorists have their own hypothesis, saying it wasn't aliens that did the work, but prior to the ancient Egyptians, another advanced civilization existed on Earth that had passed on their knowledge to them. Before we turn to the alien hybrid pharaohs, let's look at some other reasons why a certain segment of the public believes aliens came down to Earth, left, and then were worshipped as gods by ancient civilizations. For starters, we have the Moai of Easter Island and the giant stone heads that certainly couldn't have been easy to erect. There's plenty of evidence that it was possible for the Moai to build these statues, but there are still those that state that they were built in the shape of the aliens who lent a hand in their construction. Then there's the ancient Bolivian temple Pumapunku, which was built with stones weighing over 100 tons. Even today, scientists are in disagreement as to how humans moved them. The stones in the temple fit together like an interlocking puzzle, and this would have meant those builders had to have possessed a profound understanding of geometry and masonry. Not only that, the incredible intricate decorations in the stones are so outstanding experts don't really know how they managed to make them with such basic tools. Tests on mummies have shown that people in the area regularly consumed hallucinogenic plants, and to some theorists this was their way of connecting to another world, which might help explain their brilliant inspiration. We won't go through all the great wonders on this planet Earth, but there are many historical sites that boggle the mind. Take for example Stonehenge in the UK, or the temples of Vijayanagara in India that seem to have alien-looking figures and objects carved into the stonework. We are by no means attempting to sway you into thinking that just because humans in the past showed that they could do incredible things, that it means that they had help from aliens. But we're merely saying that this is a reason why some people believe this might have happened. Back to the Egyptians. Have you ever seen a picture of Pharaoh Akhenaten, the father of King Tut, who was said to have been the living embodiment of the solar deity and who died around 1336 BC? There are many remaining artifacts that depict what Akhenaten looked like, and you know what? He has an elongated head, much like the average gray alien. You can find one stone carving of him worshipping the disk of the sun, known as the Aten, with the beams of light shining down on him. Looking at this though, with his elongated head looking rather alien-like, if you didn't know better, you might think that the Great Disk was actually a spaceship, some kind of flying saucer. Of course, this is a long shot, and if you read more about ancient civilizations, you'll find that depicting people with elongated heads happened a lot, from the Australian Aborigines to the Mayans to many other places. Some have suggested that this might have been because they actually did have big heads, a deformation called macrocephaly that basically means big head in ancient Greek. This might have been the result of inbreeding or disease that led to the abnormality. It may have also been done on purpose. Cranial deformation might have also been a very painful procedure, something that children of noble birth had to go through to make them look unlike their ordinary folks. The theory is that it gave leaders to be great prestige. Whatever the reason, there's a lot of evidence of ancient people having these large heads all over the world. Some people would have you believe that these people were alien hybrids, or at least fashioned to look like the great things that came from the sky. There's no real solid evidence for this though, it's mere speculation or more like fantasy. As for the great Akhenaten, did he really have an enlarged head? Surely his mummy would tell us this, but we'll get around to that soon. Then there are the fantasies of the British tabloid press, who have at times not let the facts get in the way of telling a good tale, to put it politely. In 2016, some of the tabloids published an article about an ancient Egyptian coin that was unearthed. If you look at it, there's no doubt that one side portrays the elongated head of a gray alien. The problem with this is the fact that the only evidence of the coin being real was a line that told us the artifact was discovered by a group of people who worked on the renovation of a house in southern Egypt. We looked for more information at all on this mysterious group of renovators and couldn't find anything. We did though find coin experts talking about the alien head piece of cash, and they said this: a little research revealed that it's not even a real artifact, but a heavily retouched or photoshopped image of an actual Roman medallion in the famous collection of the Cabinet de Médailles in Paris. The hoax was uncovered by computer scientist Ralph Boulot. So much for trustworthy news sources. We found another dubious source telling us that DNA tests of Egyptian mummies revealed a gene called CXPAC5, which we're told is responsible for the building of the frontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain. 8 out of 9 mummies didn't contain this, but the mummy of Pharaoh Akhenaten did. The article then jumps to the conclusion that aliens must have planted this in the pharaoh. The blog post tells us that it's unusual to find CXPAC5 in the mummy of Akhenaten because he died at age 45, and it only appears in much older people. Akhenaten seemed to have an advanced brain. That said, we can find no one but alien enthusiasts talking about it. In fact, there are no links at all leading to the supposed study that tells us the pharaoh might have been linked somehow to aliens because of the appearance of this gene. Scientists are actually not sure where he was buried anyway, with it being suspected that he might have been laid to rest in KV-55, a tomb in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. One of the skulls found there was enlarged, but it's thought that this was because of a disease called chronic hydrocephalus. This basically means too much fluid on the brain, and that can distort the cranium. Other experts say the ancients' enlarged heads could have been down to various syndromes that cause macrocephaly. Still, the reputable experts are still debating if the skull was Akhenaten's at all, and they certainly haven't put forth a theory that aliens had planted a gene in his head that made it larger or made him more intelligent. The alien believers certainly connected a lot of invisible dots to make that story work. Finally, there's the allegedly ancient Egyptian text called the Thule Papyrus. You'll find certain sources saying this contains script that looks like it talks about UFOs. One translation of part of the text reads in English, "In the year 22, third month of winter, 6th hour of the day, the scribus of the House of Life found it was a circle of fire that was coming in the sky." Another part reads, "They were more numerous than anything. They were shining in the sky more than the sun to the limits of the four supports of heaven. Powerful was the position of the fire circles." Wow, that certainly sounds like it might have been an account of an alien sighting. The only problem is the Thule Papyrus is not an authentic papyrus. It's a transcription of an alleged document of whose origin is dubious at best. Even some ufologists call the entire thing a hoax, saying someone was handed an ancient document and told it was a transcription of the original, and then someone translated that, and that's about it. In something called the Condon Report, a report by a group funded by the US Air Force on the possibility of alien life coming to Earth, this Thule Papyrus was talked about. The researchers wrote that it was taken from secondary and tertiary sources without any attempts to verify original sources. They also said that all such accounts of UFO sightings handed down from ancient times have proved to be weak and unverifiable. Until they can be verified, they're meaningless. From what we could see, a lot of people don't bother with the verification process, but are quite sure when writing their blogs from their bedrooms that they are right. Their evidence is like the Thule Papyrus in digital form. Dubious evidence handed down and rewritten and copied and passed on. It makes for a good story, but until we have more evidence, that's all it is, a story. As you can see, a lot of people claiming that pharaohs were part alien or contacted by aliens are connecting a lot of dots that don't necessarily mean much except in their own minds. They already have a picture they want to see, but science doesn't work by starting from a conclusion and finding evidence to back it up. It's the opposite. We look at the evidence we have and use that to come to conclusions. With that, we'll finish with a quote. In the words of astrophysicist Carl Sagan, in the long litany of ancient astronaut pop archaeology, the cases of apparent interest have perfectly reasonable alternative explanations, or have been misreported, or are simple prevarications, hoaxes, and distortions. Do you love strange, unexpected stories that defy belief but are completely true? Then you'll love the new show I Am. Fascinating tales told from the perspective of those who lived them. Find out what it was like to be a plague doctor during an outbreak of the Black Death, or the captain of the Titanic as it sank into the sea. Each episode, you'll jump inside the mind of a new person and get a first-person view on incredible events like no other. New episodes every week. Be one of the first to subscribe now and tell us who you want to see brought to life in I Am. We all need a bit of privacy now and again. It's your human right, after all, to go about your day and not be watched over all the time by some kind of Big Brother surveillance technology. As that technology improves, though, and since you willingly feed huge chunks of personal data in a connected device, to some extent Big Brother already knows a lot about you. But imagine a bigger brother is watching over us. Surveillance that tracks humankind. That's not part of the world we know. Imagine the Earth is a kind of zoo and we're specimens to be studied. That might sound far-fetched, but there are some serious people who believe it to be true. Let us explain. There's this thing called zoo theory, which is sometimes called the zoo hypothesis. This theory tells us that there's a chance that we're being watched over by extraterrestrial life, but those guys are just not in the mood to tell us about it. We are animals living in their zoo. According to this theory, one of the reasons they don't come down here is that they want us to evolve naturally. Their superior intelligence would blow our minds. They might be looking down right now thinking, it's about time those guys stopped having wars and started sharing things, but they want us to evolve by ourselves. Then there's the Fermi paradox, which basically states that there are billions of stars in the Milky Way, and so the chance that humans are alone is pretty much nil. There just has to be intelligent life out there, and it must have technology that allows interstellar travel. Then you have to consider the universe outside of the Milky Way, and the number of stars is mind-blowing. Surely it's arrogant to believe that we're all alone, as if us little humans rule the universe. There's an organization called Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence, or METI for short. This group comprises of many scientists, and they get together to discuss the possibility of contacting aliens, or us being watched over by aliens. On their website, the first thing you see is a statement that says METI doesn't rule out the possibility of life outside of Earth. If you scroll down, you'll see their list of objectives, and the first one goes like this: to conduct scientific research and educational programs in messaging extraterrestrial intelligence and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Scientists from all walks of life that are in METI are doing things right now, such as working on interstellar transmission technology. If ET could phone home, maybe humans could develop such long-distance communication tech. They also discuss the Fermi paradox and something called the Drake equation, which takes into account the size and age of the universe and what might be in it. Again, these people are not conspiracy theorists getting high in parents' basements. They are scientists. The president of METI is one Douglas Vakoch, and he's a renowned astrobiologist. This science is concerned with the evolution of the universe. For a long time, he's been working on interstellar messaging, but he's also well aware that human senses might not exactly work with alien senses. Even if we could send messages to other galaxies, if we said, "Hey guys, how's it going?" it might not work out. In fact, one of the latest blogs on the METI website asks if human language is any way to try and connect with aliens. The writer asks, is it a good way to send information to beings who are likely to be very different from us, whose bodies, sensory capabilities, cognition, environment, and experiences may be very different from our own? Then if we send out a message in human language form, which language? She states that while the Voyager disk, which is aboard NASA's famous Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 spacecraft, might have lots of information on it in 55 languages, we might better try and communicate in signs, shapes, and symbols and numbers. What's on the disk, you might ask? Well, if aliens pick it up, they'll find images of nature here on Earth, as well as many sounds of nature. They'll hear a message from former US President Jimmy Carter and be able to get down with a bit of Morse code. They'll see images of humans doing things and listen to the likes of Mozart and Beethoven. Chuck Berry is also on there, but unfortunately no Led Zeppelin. They actually wanted to put the Beatles on the disc, but the record company EMI wouldn't allow that. Yeah, it's true. So back to the zoo. Those guys at METI often discuss something called the Great Silence, which relates to the question of why do these galactic zookeepers keep out of our face? Well, it's like we said, if aliens are that superior in intelligence, if they came into contact with us, they'd mess with our heads. We'd have to reevaluate life itself, and this would cause chaos. Just imagine if one day your dog got up and said in perfect English, "Hey buddy, can we skip the walk today? I'm thinking about going to Rover's house to discuss Wittgenstein's theory of the talking lion." If that happened, we'd have to start rewriting a few books, so the aliens stay away. In 2018, at a METI meeting, they talked about the idea of us being quarantined by aliens. This is how one researcher at METI explained that. It seems likely that extraterrestrials are imposing a galactic quarantine because they realize it would be culturally disruptive for us to learn about them. It's kind of the same thing as talking dogs. If they got into contact, our culture and society would be so disrupted, we would just collapse for a while. Just imagine if right now, as you're watching this, an alien spacecraft pops up outside your window. You're then informed that the world is an illusion and your consciousness is eternal and infinite. We bet you wouldn't clock in at work or go to school tomorrow. Some folks at METI also say that we haven't developed full cognitive abilities yet, that there might be another level of consciousness in our evolution. The famous, now deceased Terence McKenna believed that certain psychedelics could provide a glimpse of what was possible in terms of developing a higher consciousness. He once said the idea of aliens coming down in a metal ship is totally preposterous. He believed alien life could be already here, and they might actually be in psilocybin mushrooms hidden in the very atoms of the things. He said those mushrooms are disguised as a drug, but might really be aliens. They are here, according to him, but we just don't get it yet. This might sound crazy to you, but serious scientists are now talking about the mind-blowing substance dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which takes people to places that are out of this world. Yes, lots of people visit aliens on their colorful trips. Research has shown that some people are absolutely convinced they saw aliens. This is why scientists at Johns Hopkins have been studying those breakthrough trips. We found more scientific research in the US that is taking seriously the possibility of DMT shooting people to another universe. In the mind, anyway. We're not saying this is proof that aliens are among us and we're being watched by them, but it's interesting that science is taking DMT so seriously as of late. Joe Rogan must be very proud, because any chance he gets he mentions his DMT experiences. He certainly wouldn't dismiss the alien contact theory. Then there's this theory. Maybe millions of years ago, aliens detected life on a blue planet, the one we call home. They thought, let's send some signals to that place and see what happens. But let's just say that vampire squids and the Gojirasaurus weren't up for chatting. We weren't evolved just yet. We pretty much spent most of our time eating, fighting, procreating, and pooping. The aliens had to wait. So what did they do next? Once they'd been snubbed by basic life on Earth, they sent a probe here and bugged a rock. Why, you might ask? The answer is they wanted to keep an eye on us. Back to the zoo theory thing. The rock they bugged, though, was what was called co-orbital, meaning that it flies around the Earth. If you want a good view of Earth, there's not much point in bugging a rock actually on the planet. A researcher named James Benford, who's also part of the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence group, came up with this idea. Why does he think that? Well, it seems like quite the long shot. Well, it's not that he's certain, but it would make sense. What he's saying is that why not go check out some of those co-orbitals and see if any of them have not been bugged. Another researcher wrote, if it costs very little to go take a look, why not? Even if we don't find ET, we might find something of interest. The closest one is about 38 times further away from Earth than the Moon. We call it the Earth's closest companion, and NASA has said that it's not going anywhere. Well, we mean it's gonna hang around near Earth for centuries to come. That's why some folks are saying we need to do some more extraterrestrial archaeology. Start digging, NASA, because there might be a chance that we're part of an alien-led surveillance state. You might think that it's very hard to send a spacecraft that far, but from what we can see, it's not that hard. In fact, China said it'll send a spacecraft to Earth's closest companion in 2024. The spaceship Chang'e will be equipped with robots that will do a bit of digging around. Maybe they'll come back with some bugs and blow our minds. But if there's a trade war still going on, you can expect the Chinese not to share in the spoils. If in 2025 China suddenly starts speaking alien, you know how it happened. Some of those researchers really do think that those space rocks might be bugged, and they are the best chance we have of finding out if we're in a space zoo. One scientist said, if we don't find anything, that means no one has come to look at life of Earth for over billions of years. That's a big surprise, a stunning thing. When you consider what we've done over our 10,000 plus years of being fairly civilized, imagine what a species could do given a million years. Imagine what we will be capable of in a million years. Yes, we'll be all over the universe. There are things we'll achieve that we can't possibly imagine now. Imagine telling a guy in the dark ages about a show you watch online called the infographic show. He could not possibly envision the future, and neither can you. With that in mind, maybe a super civilization did visit us a long time ago. Maybe we're just slow to get out of the blocks. The idea of there being these super civilized space folks has been embraced by a lot of our greatest scientists. Carl Sagan was one of those scientists, and here's a lovely quote from him. The universe is a pretty big place. If it's just us, seems like an awful waste of space. So that's it, really. When you look up into the sky, just imagine someone has been watching us evolve. The big brother who's been around for millions and millions of years saw us crawl out of the swamp. They watched as we stood up and started making spears and drawing pictures of buffalo on cave walls. We hunted and gathered, and a few thousand years later, we started talking about gods that live in the skies. They must have loved that. Then they witnessed endless wars as we struggled to fight over land or which region was the right one. Come on, guys, they thought. It's us, we're your gods, get with the program. They were astounded when we built bombs that could destroy an entire planet. They knew who killed JFK and why those guards were sleeping when Mr. Epstein ran out of air. They're confounded by President Donald Trump's Twitter feed, and they're keeping an eye on you right now as you get to the end of the show. We might also add that while it's very plausible that aliens exist and are watching over us, in terms of scientific proof, well, that's yet to come. Life on Earth. Scientists have been studying it for centuries, creating a timeline from when the first single-cell beings emerged in primordial waters to today, when billions of humans populate the surface. But there's one question they've never been able to answer with 100% certainty. How exactly did it begin? Most scientists think it started from a complex chemical reaction in the water of the early Earth. Some argue for a more intelligent hand guiding the process. The only thing that's sure is that no one's sure, and everyone has an opinion. But what if the origin of life on Earth didn't actually come from Earth? Could life on Earth be the product of extraterrestrials? So far, we don't have any conclusive proof for or against life outside of Earth. No contact has been made and no DNA or fossils from other life forms have been discovered. But we've only explored a tiny fragment of the universe out there, almost none of it in person. And the odds that countless planets surrounding countless stars would have no other planets capable of supporting life since the Big Bang is pretty slim. And after billions of years of this universe existing, many of those worlds may not exist anymore. Asteroids, comets, and other interstellar phenomena can immediately bring a crushing end to any world's life forms, as the dinosaurs found out the hard way. But what if the life from those worlds didn't stay on those worlds? The hypothesis is panspermia, which claims that not only does life exist throughout the universe, but that it gets carried from world to world by traveling objects like asteroids and comets, the space dust that gets attached to anything traveling through space, even the spaceships that humans send to explore the moon and nearby planets may have microscopic forms of life in them that travel to other worlds and seed them when they land, creating the building blocks of future life on those worlds. But could anything survive in the cold vacuum of space? Well, we couldn't, and neither could most animals on Earth. But when you look at smaller animals, some survive climates that could kill humans in seconds. The Pompeii worm lives in deep hydrothermal vents that can reach up to 175 degrees Fahrenheit. The flatbark beetle, which lives in some of the coldest climates in North America, produces natural antifreeze chemicals that help it survive in the winter and enter a sort of stasis, smoothly surviving the coldest parts of the winter while we're fighting over the thermostat. Neither of them could survive in space, but that's not the case for one microscopic creature. The name water bear probably creates cute images of an ursine mammal enjoying a bath in the river, but the real thing is much less cuddly and also less likely to eat you. Also called a tardigrade, this tiny organism is the only form of life that seems to be able to live anywhere, even in the most extreme conditions. They've been found everywhere from deserts to hot springs, and they may even potentially exist in space, thanks to a crash of a sample from a spaceship on the moon. These tiny multi-legged creatures can dry up and fall into a state that resembles death, but when exposed to water, even decades later, they spring back to life. So, if life originated from outside Earth, how exactly did it get here? There are a couple of theories of exactly how these building blocks of life arrived on our ancient planet, most of them based around interstellar physics. One theory from a Swedish scientist in 1903 theorizes that the radiation pressure from stars can send particles through space, but this would only work for the smallest particles, and many, if not all, would be killed off by the radiation. But it's possible that alien bacteria or viruses could survive if shielded from UV radiation. The other main theory is that the particles that led to the creation of life were hitchhikers on rocks, coming into contact with Earth when the rocks crash-landed here. While we know how asteroids, comets, and meteors travel through the galaxy, this is under far more extreme conditions than any life form has been known to survive, surviving in the vacuum of space for years on end before crash landing. But there is another theory, that the alien life forms didn't come here accidentally. What if the alien life out there was intelligent and advanced enough that they could have sent the building blocks of life toward Earth deliberately? The first possibility of this is accidental transport. On Earth, there have been countless cases of people throwing trash into the water and having it swept somewhere completely different, often endangering animal life in the process. It's possible that an alien civilization would have been advanced enough to send waste products into space and dump them on an uninhabited world. That, thanks to the trace DNA on the waste, evolved into Earth as we know today. But other theories say that seeding of Earth might be much more deliberate. Directed panspermia is the idea that alien species created life on Earth via transport of organisms from their world. The idea of a deliberate seeding of this planet sidesteps a lot of the issues with the other theories, because the aliens would have been able to shield the samples for their trip, eliminating the threat that the journey through space or the cosmic radiation would kill off the organisms before they ever reach their target. The alien species, if advanced enough to send samples into space, would be able to send them at high speeds that would allow them to reach their destination in a more feasible time. So, why would aliens want to seed our planet? The first possible theory is that the aliens were looking to secure and protect life in space by spreading it among a larger area. Even the strongest civilization could be felled by a natural disaster or a stray comet. And when life exists on more than one world, it's insured against the whims of the cosmos. Of course, that was 3.5 billion years ago, and the odds are good that any alien civilization that seeded Earth at the dawn of our world would be long gone themselves by now. But what if they weren't? There have been many theories about aliens making contact with Earth, but thus far no conclusive proof has been found, regardless of how many people say they were abducted by a flying saucer. But if aliens are out there and may even have ties to the creation of life on Earth, then why haven't they made contact yet? One theory is that they simply don't want to. They're more than happy just to watch. This is called the zoo hypothesis, and it states that we're all essentially living in a giant terrarium. Whatever these aliens are, they have technology far beyond ours, and they're perfectly happy watching us as our still primitive planet slowly evolves. If we don't know about their existence, it's because they don't want us to know yet. So, are there any problems with this idea? Just one big one. Have you ever tried to get a group of people to agree on anything? Trying to get 10 people to agree on one place to eat is hard enough. Imagine how difficult it'd be to get an entire civilization to agree to keep a secret forever without any of them breaking the code of silence and broadcasting their existence to our human zoo. It would have had to last millions of years of humans and their ancestors existing, and likely countless generations of the aliens not breaking their own protocol. That's why many people say the zoo hypothesis resembles creationism and religious theory more than panspermia. But have the aliens truly maintained a hands-off approach all this time? A popular idea, but maybe not so popular among scientists, is that Earth has been visited repeatedly by advanced alien civilizations that may have interacted with humans before recorded history, called the ancient astronauts theory. It often has ties to various religions. After all, how many religious texts refer to powerful and mysterious beings descending from the heavens and performing miracles? But is there any evidence of these interstellar visits? If you watch a program called Ancient Aliens, a lot. This popular documentary-style series looks at evidence of alien interactions with humans with a particular focus on early civilizations and the idea that certain technology and buildings couldn't have been constructed by pre-industrial humans alone. They look at mythology of giants and gods, massive structures like the pyramids that show up across the world, and technology that seems too advanced for the time, like the massive clockwork Antikythera mechanism of ancient Greece. With 16 seasons and almost 200 episodes, there are a lot of believers, but just as many detractors. The ancient astronauts theory, and ancient aliens in particular, has been criticized for using selective evidence and disregarding the contributions of early native cultures. The construction methods for megalithic structures like Stonehenge, the Great Pyramids of Egypt, and the Mayan pyramids have been investigated and largely proven. While there's still a lot of mysteries surrounding ancient architecture like the giant stone spheres of Costa Rica, few of them seem to point to aliens, but that hasn't stopped the speculation from growing. We don't know for sure if aliens have visited Earth, but there's a chance that their DNA is still with us. We might be all descended from aliens if their organisms seeded our world eons ago. The most likely scenario if we evolved from alien microorganisms is that we're so radically different from the original species by now that there'd be no similarity anymore. If an alien species did seed Earth deliberately, then the odds are it didn't seed Earth with the most advanced form of life on its planet, but one of the smallest and easiest to transport. The continuum of life on Earth indicates that life likely started with microorganisms swimming in the water before turning into larger forms of life and eventually heading onto land, a far cry from the aliens who might have organized Earth's seeding. But could humanity's ties to alien DNA be a lot more recent? Many proponents of the ancient astronauts theory suggest that the aliens may have continued to visit Earth up until the early days of humanity and may have actually bred with humans, leaving traces of their DNA in ours. While the idea of aliens on a pleasure cruise looking for some exotic party times might be relatable, especially if they have common DNA with those party kids who hit Cancun every spring break, there are a lot of holes in the theory. The aliens would have to still be around and in a similar shape billions of years after Earth was first seeded, and they'd have to be genetically compatible with humans despite those billions of years of evolution. So, no, it's not very likely that your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa was an alien. But that doesn't mean this kind of interbreeding between humans and their distant relatives isn't possible. Recent studies indicate that human fossils have traces of DNA from ancient humans that preceded Homo sapiens. The more famous Neanderthals are in there, but so are an extinct species of archaic humans we know relatively little about. The Denisovans, only identified in 2010 in Siberia, they've been identified from a few bones and teeth that are distinct from other species. When ancient genomes were sequenced for the first time, scientists found fragments of genetic code that didn't match up with Homo sapiens. Neanderthals were quickly identified. In fact, it's estimated that most humans besides Africans have up to 4% of trace Neanderthal DNA in their genome. No one knows exactly what population of ancient humans may be lurking in the recesses of the human genome, both ancient and modern. What we do know is that modern humans are a complex mix of influences that made us what we are. Could one of those influences be from beyond our solar system? We don't have proof of that yet. But the human genome is a mystery, and we don't have proof that it's impossible either. For more on alien visitors, check out This Will Happen When the Government Confirms Aliens Exist, or watch How Did the Dinosaurs Die for more on the chaos objects from space can cause.